Picture this: a cold, rainy night in London, October of 1894. Inside a small flat on Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sits in silence before a dim, fading fire, his violin untouched, his expression distant, restless, lost in thought. A priceless jewel, the Royal Sapphire of Kashmir, has vanished from a vault said to be unbreakable. No forced entry, no witnesses, no clues. And as the soft rain traces slow paths down the window glass, an unexpected visitor arrives at his door, carrying with him a mystery that, at first glance, seems impossible to solve. But as you're about to discover, in this case, the true surprise does not lie in the theft itself, but in the quiet intention hidden behind every glance, every silence, and every carefully spoken. A gentle October rain had begun falling over in the early hours of the morning. It was not the kind of rain that arrived with fury or made the streets run like rivers. Instead, it came quietly, like a distant conversation that never raised its voice. Each drop landed with care upon the cobblestones, on rooftop, and on the iron railings that lined the narrow street. By mid-afternoon, the city seemed wrapped in a cool, damp mist that blurred the edges of and softened the glow of the gas. Inside 221B Baker Street, the familiar sitting room was bathed in a kind of muted light that only such weather could bring. The large window pane, streaked with slow-moving trail, offered a blurred view of the street below. Pedestrians walked with hunched shoulders and quickened steps. Umbrellas tilted at awkward angles as they hurried along, their boots splashing through shallow puddles. Horse-drawn carriages moved more cautiously than usual, wheels slipping slightly as they crossed wet stones. The fire in the hearth burned low but steady, providing just enough warmth to keep the room comfortably temperate. The smell of damp wool drifted faintly from a coat hung near the door. A faint trace of Holmes's pipe tobacco lingered near the mantel, blending with the older, deeper sense of paper, varnished wood, and the lingering chemical notes from past experiments. Sherlock Holmes sat in his favorite armchair, positioned at a thoughtful angle toward both the fireplace and the window. His tall, lean figure was partially obscured by the back of the chair. His face remained visible, enough for any careful observer to note the curious stillness in his expression. His violin rested untouched. The bow lay parallel to it on a small side table, carefully placed as though Holmes had every intention of playing, but had changed his mind. His gaze was distant, fixed on no particular point. One might assume he was watching the flames dance in the fireplace, but Watson knew better. Holmes wasn't seeing the room at all. His mind, as always, was elsewhere, wandering through invisible pathways that only he could. His eyes had taken on that familiar, faraway look that often appeared between cases, when the outside world failed to present him with anything sufficiently challenging. Dr. John Watson sat across from him, occupying the chair nearest the window. A folded medical journal rested on his knee, its pages left unturned for the better part of half an hour. Watson had pretended to read, but in truth, his attention had drifted. The quiet of the room, combined with the hypnotic tapping of rain against glass, had lulled him into a peaceful, contemplative state. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking each passing second with gentle. The sound was barely noticeable during the busy hours of the day, but now, in the near silence of late afternoon, it seemed louder, more present. Its rhythm joined the subtle orchestra of the house, the occasional creak of floorboards as the building set, the soft sigh of wind pressing against the window panes, and the far-off clatter of a carriage navigating Baker Street. Watson glanced at Holmes, observing the way his friend sat motionless, with one leg crossed over the other and fingers lightly curled against the polished wood of his violin. It was unusual, Watson, to see Holmes remain so still for even during quiet periods. Holmes usually found small distractions, reaching for his pipe, flipping through the pages of a monograph, scribbling restless notes on scraps of paper. But today, there was none of it. The doctor considered breaking the silence, perhaps with a remark about the weather or a suggestion for a walk. Yet something about the atmosphere held him back. There was a peculiar tranquility in the room, a gentle weight in the air that discouraged sudden noise or unnecessary conversation. After several more minutes, Watson leaned back in his chair, resting his head against the worn upholstery and allowing his gaze to drift toward the ceiling. The glow from the fireplace cast soft room, the light flickering against the brass buttons on Holmes's waistcoat, catching now and then on the glass of a framed photograph that hung near the bookshelf. Unseasonably cold for October, voice low and measured, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the delicate balance of the room. Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he blinked slowly, surfacing from deep waters of thought, and turned his head just slightly toward Watson. "The weather rarely follows the calendar," Holmes replied, his tone even softer than Watson's. "Like most things in this city, it has a mind of its own," and smiled. He had expected no less from Holmes, always observing, always ready with a remark that carried just a shade more meaning than the words themselves. Holmes shifted his gaze back to the window. The rain had grown steadier now, its rhythm on the glass becoming more pronounced, yet still far from aggressive. Pedestrians had thinned out on the street. The lamps along Baker Street began to flicker to life, their hazy glow turning the mist into a pale golden curtain. For a while neither man spoke again. The quiet between them was not awkward, nor was it lonely. It was the kind of shared silence that only long-standing companionship allows, the simple comfort of existing together in the same space, without the need to fill it with words. As the evening deepened, Watson began to feel the gentle pull of drowsing, the combination of the steady rain, the warmth of the fire, and the slow ticking of the clock worked together like a lullaby composed by the city itself. Holmes, however, remained fully awake, unchanged, his mind clearly working through some invisible calculation or memory. He closed his eyes for just a moment, not to rest, but to focus more fully on the sounds around him. The city breathes differently in the rain. It conceals, and it reveals. Watson opened one eye. "Philosophy, Holmes? That's rare from you." Holmes didn't. He simply opened his eyes again and let them drift back to the blurred view of the wet street beyond the window. And so the evening continued, calm, slow, and unhurried. The kind of evening that London offered only a few times each year. An evening where time seemed to stretch and the rest of the world. Inside 221B Baker Street, with rain on the glass and firelight on the walls, two friends remained at peace, unaware that soon a nervous visitor would arrive, and with him the first shadow of mystery. The rain persisted well into mid-morning, a steady, unbroken curtain that wrapped the city in gray softness, the kind of day when even the gas lamps along Baker Street seemed to glow a little weaker, their flickering light blurred by the thin veil of moisture. Inside 221B Baker Street, the morning unfolded with slow familiarity. The smell of coal and damp wool lingered faintly in the air. Mrs. Hudson had already brought up breakfast earlier, fresh bread, a soft-boiled egg for Watson, and a pot of strong tea. Holmes had barely touched his plate, as was often the case when his mind drifted into that strange, liminal space between observation and contemplation. The sitting room felt unusually still. The crackle from the hearth offered the only real sound, apart from the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel. Even the traffic outside seemed hesitant today. The clip-clop of horses and the rattle of carriage wheels softened by the thick London mist. Watson sat in his usual chair, flipping absent-mindedly through the Times, though his eyes skimmed past the printed words with little interest. His thoughts kept wandering back to Holmes, who remained seated near the window, one leg crossed over the other, fingers loosely interlocked beneath his chin. The detective's gaze was unfocused, somewhere between the rain-smeared glass and the invisible map of thought that always seemed to unfold in his mind. During moments like this, Holmes had barely moved in over an hour. The violin lay untouched across the side table. The pipe, long cold, sat next to an open monograph on mineralogy that Holmes had glanced at briefly before abandoning it. Watson considered making conversation, perhaps a casual comment on the state of the weather or some minor note from the morning paper, but experience had taught him that such interruptions during moments of Holmes's internal processing were rarely welcomed. It was nearly 10:30 when the first indication of change arrived. the muted creak of footsteps ascending the stairs from the hallway below. Holmes stirred slightly, his eyes narrowed, and his head tilted just enough to suggest that his attention had shifted to the sounds beyond the door. Mrs. Hudson's knock came seconds later, 3 polite raps, followed by the soft turning of the handle. "Mr. Holmes," her voice carefully modulated in that way only she had mastered over years of service. "You have a visitor. Says the matter is urgent." Before Holmes could even respond, the man in question appeared behind her, stepping into the room without waiting for permission. Both Holmes and Watson turned to regard him. He was tall, though slightly stooped, giving the impression of a man weighed down more by circumstance than age. His hair, thick and dark, with only the earliest hints of gray, clung damply to his forehead. His overcoat, though of fine material, bore the clear marks of hurried dressing, buttons mismatched, a sleeve slightly twisted at the cuff, as though pulled on in haste. Drops of rain clung to his shoulders, and there was a faint, disheveled quality to his appearance that suggested both wealth and recent. In his hands he clutched a black bowler hat as though it were a lifeline, his knuckles whitening against the fabric with every passing second. Holmes regarded him with measured curiosity. "You are expected, sir," he said calmly, "and you arrive with commendable urgency. Please, come in. The fire will serve you well on a morning like this." The man hesitated, offering a quick, almost apologetic glance toward Mrs. Hudson, who, understanding her cue, withdrew and quietly closed the door behind her. Crossing the threshold fully now, the visitor moved toward the chair Holmes indicated, but didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing near the fireplace, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the way a man might when rehearsing an unwelcome Holmes allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to encourage the man to speak without pressure, but with inevitable surrender to his own need. "My name." The man's voice cracked faintly, and he cleared his throat. "My name is Archibald Penrose." Watson recognized the surname immediately. Penrose, of Penrose and Larchmere, the jewelers in Southwark, a respectable establishment known throughout London society for its discretion and its careful curation of rare gems. Holmes gave no outward sign that the name struck any particular chord with him, though Watson, the detective's mind, now fully awake, had already begun constructing silent associations. Holmes gestured again toward the chair. "Please, Mr. Penrose, be at ease. You have the floor." This time Penrose obeyed, though he perched only at the edge of the seat, leaning forward with restless energy. His eyes, dark and rimmed with fatigue, flicked between Holmes and Watson, as though calculating the measure of confidence he should place in each. "I come to you," Penrose began, exhaling slowly as though releasing more than just air, "with a matter of great urgency, and, I fear, great embarrassment." Holmes remained still, offering nothing but the steady invitation of silence that encouraged men to empty their burdens. "I hesitate to involve Scotland Yard," shifting his "the risk to my business, my reputation. I need hardly explain to you the consequences of public scandal in my trade." Holmes nodded once, slowly. "Discretion is understood, Mr. Penrose." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the motion. "It concerns the Royal Sapphire of Kashmir," Penrose said, the words emerging with a mixture of dread and disbelief. "The gem has disappeared." Watson couldn't help the slight intake of breath that escaped him at the mention of the stone. The Royal Sapphire was a known piece, even to those outside the jewelry world. A deep, velvety blue gemstone, famed for its clarity and size, rumored to be nearly flawless, and traced through a lineage of Indian princes before finding its way to London. Holmes's face, though composed, now held a different focus. His gaze settled directly on Penrose. "When did you last see the gem?" Holmes asked. 2 days ago. It was secured in the vault at my shop, as it always is when not on display for clients. The vault is fitted with a Swiss locking mechanism, precision engineering. It has been maintained meticulously for years. There has never been a single incident until now. Describe the circumstances of its discovery, or lack thereof. Penrose hesitated. "Yesterday morning, when we performed our routine inventory check, the case within the vault was empty. No signs of forced entry. The mechanism itself untouched. The lock remained in perfect condition, as though it had never been disturbed. Holmes's fingers began their familiar steepling gesture beneath his chin, but he said nothing yet. "And the key holders?" Watson asked softly, prompting the next detail. "Only 3 people," Penrose said quickly, as though anticipating the question. "Myself, my niece, Miss Clarissa Penrose, and my business partner, Mr. Edwin Larchmere. There is also Mr. Wiggins, our clockmaker." At the mention of the name, Penrose's composure faltered. "Wiggins?" Holmes repeated to himself. "An external contractor, I presume?" Penrose shook his head. "Not exactly. Been with us for years. Maintains the vault mechanism. Trusted, discreet. If you'd asked me last week, I would have said beyond suspicion." Ari Holmes's gaze remained steady, but Watson saw the flicker of interest there. "Yet here you sit, Mr. Penrose," Holmes said quietly, implying that something has occurred which defies both trust and logic. The room grew still once more. Only the distant creak of the building's woodwork and the faint hiss of rain against the glass filled the space between words. Penrose exhaled shakily, as though releasing something held far too long. "I need your help, Mr. Holmes," voice lower now. "If word of this reaches the public, if Scotland Yard arrives at my door with questions I cannot answer, everything I've built, my family's name, it will be ruined." Holmes uncrossed his legs and rose from his chair, walking slowly toward the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street. But for several long seconds he remained there, silent, hands resting. Watson could feel the shift in the room, the moment when Holmes's mind moved from quiet observation into active engagement. Finally, Holmes turned. "Very well, Mr. Penrose," he said, voice low but steady. "I will take your case." Penrose's shoulders sagged with visible relief, though anxiety still clung to him like the rainwater on his coat. Holmes stepped toward the small corner of the room where he kept his walking stick and hat. "We shall begin," Holmes said, "by visiting your establishment in Southwark. There is no sense in theorizing from afar when the scene of the mystery awaits." Watson rose, already reaching for his coat. Penrose stood too, visibly eager now, as though the act of engaging Holmes's services had lifted a portion of the weight from his conscience. As the 3 men prepared to leave Baker Street behind, the rain outside continued its patient descent, steady, unwavering, like the first quiet beat of an approaching storm. The journey to Southwark unfolded beneath the same gray curtain of rain that had persisted since dawn. As the hansom cab rolled steadily like streets, the city outside blurred behind fogged glass, a moving watercolor of muted browns and grays. The familiar sounds of London, distant shouts from vendors, the rattle of carriage wheels on uneven stone, the hollow clatter of horseshoes, were all softened by the steady, almost meditative percussion of raindrops on the cab's roof. Inside the cab, Sherlock Holmes sat with his usual composed stillness, his gaze lowered, his gloved fingers resting lightly on the ivory head of his walking stick. He appeared at ease, but Watson, after years of observation, could sense the electric current of thought running just beneath his friend's placid surface. Holmes's eyes closed briefly, and Watson knew better than to interrupt the flow of deduction already at work. Archibald Penrose, seated opposite, shifted restlessly on the worn leather seat, occasionally dabbing at his damp forehead with a handkerchief. Though the interior of the cab was warm, the man's nervous energy radiated like a subtle but unrelenting heat. His hands never settled for long. They moved from pocket to pocket, from the brim of his hat to the fold of his coat, as though driven by an internal restlessness he could neither control nor conceal. Watson, ever the physician at heart, took careful mental notes of Penrose's physical condition: pale skin, eyes shadowed with fatigue, a slight tremor in the fingertips. It wasn't the typical appearance of a man dealing merely with the stress of a missing gemstone. There was something more profound at work, perhaps guilt or fear, or some unspoken dread yet to surface. After nearly 20 minutes, the cab slowed to a stop on a narrow street lined with aging brick buildings, their facades darkened by decades of London. The rain had pooled along the edges of the walkway, and gas lamps stirred faintly in the late morning gloom. Holmes stepped down first, his tall frame unfolding with practiced grace. Penrose exited next, glancing nervously up and down the street as though expecting some unseen witness to emerge from the mist. Watson followed, adjusting his coat collar against the chill. Before them stood the modest, impeccably maintained storefront of Penrose and Larchmere Jewelry. The shop's exterior spoke of quiet refinement, polished brass fittings around the door, glass panes free of grime, a single velvet-curtained display window showcasing a small arrangement of modest pieces, a silver pocket watch, a delicate pearl necklace, and a pair of sapphire earrings arranged with understated care. No ostentation, no showy advertisement of wealth, just the kind of discretion a jeweler of serious reputation would cultivate. Holmes paused at the entrance, taking a slow, almost lazy glance up at the small engraved sign above the door before pushing it open. Inside, the air shifted immediately. The faint smell of polish, wood, and velvet filled the space. Shelves of dark mahogany lined the walls, each fitted with recessed glass cases displaying select items, rings, brooches, cufflinks, all arranged with fastidious attention. The floor beneath their feet was carpeted in a deep burgundy, absorbing the sound of their steps. A young assistant behind the counter glanced up, recognized Mr. Penrose at once, and with a quick, understanding nod, disappeared into a back room, no doubt briefed beforehand on the delicate nature of today's visit. Penrose gestured silently for Holmes and Watson to follow him beyond the public showroom. They passed through a discreetly placed door near the rear, marked only by a small brass plate, private. Beyond it lay the inner sanctum of the business, a narrow corridor leading to two small offices, one occupied by Penrose himself, and the other, judging by the neat plaque on the frosted glass door, by Mr. Edwin Larchmere. But Penrose didn't stop there. He continued past the offices, leading them down a tighter, stone-walled passage, illuminated by a single hanging lamp. At the far end stood the vault. It dominated the room with quiet authority. Its steel door, brushed to a soft sheen, bore the unmistakable signature of Swiss engineering. The lock, a complex assembly of dials and levers, glinted under the low light, intricate yet deceptively elegant in design. Holmes stepped forward, placing one gloved hand lightly on the cool surface. He knelt slowly, inspecting the hinges. The seams were steel met stone, the faint scrape marks around the locking dial that suggested years of routine use. Impressive. More to himself than Penrose stood nearby, twisting his hat in his hands again. There's no damage, no scratches, no dents. The mechanism functions perfectly. The only impossibility is that the gem inside is gone. Holmes straightened, then turned toward Watson. Note the design, indicating the door's thickness and the unique positioning of rotary system. Any attempt at forced entry would leave obvious scars. Watson nodded. Even to his untrained eye, the vault door appeared unblemished. Holmes turned back to Penrose. Walk me through the discovery. Penrose, a slow breath, steadying. Yesterday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, I opened the shop as usual. Clarissa, my niece, was already present. She arrives early most days to handle inventory and correspondence. He paused. We entered the vault together. I turned the dial myself. The combination is changed every 6 months, and only 3 of us, myself, Clarissa, and Mr. Larchmere, know it. Wiggins has access to the locking mechanism, of course, but only for maintenance, and never the combination. And when you opened it? Holmes prompted gently. The tray that should have held the sapphire was empty, Penrose's voice dropping to a near whisper. Everything else, untouched. Every other piece of jewelry and gemstone was exactly where it should be. Only the sapphire, missing. Holmes remained silent, letting the weight of the words fill the air. After a moment, he crossed to the far corner of the vault room, where a small brass floor vent sat beneath the wall panel. He knelt, inspecting it, running his fingers along the edge. Then, standing again, with that same thoughtful frown, Watson knew no signs of tampering, almost as if speaking to the vault itself. Penrose's voice trembled now. I've spent the past 24 hours questioning everything. Could I have been careless? Could one of my trusted people have betrayed me? But the facts remain impossible. Holmes stepped back from the vault, his expression unreadable. Mr. Penrose, he finally, I will need to speak with every individual who has had, no matter how brief. Penrose, of course. Holmes adjusted his coat, glancing once more at the smooth steel of the vault. And before the day is over, I will want to see the vault's interior with great care. Without waiting for a reply, Holmes turned toward the door, already composing the next series of questions in his mind. Watson followed, casting one last look at the untouched lock and the anxious figure of Archibald Penrose, who remained standing near the vault, his face pale, his hands trembling, as though the very air around him had grown heavier with mystery. Outside, the rain continued its steady descent, draping Southwark in a wet, reluctant light as the first real layers of the case began to unfold. After the inspection of the vault, Holmes requested a brief tour of the surrounding rooms, the rear storage, the administrative, offices, and even the small workshop where minor repairs and adjustments to jewelry were made. With every step he moved, sensory information that others would never notice, pausing to run his fingers along door frame, stooping to inspect floorboard, leaning close to window latches to test for looseness or recent disturbance. Watson followed, notebook in hand, making occasional observations at Holmes's request, noting the layout, the condition of each door and lock, and the positioning of furniture. The establishment was small but expertly maintained, a true testament to the discretion and discipline of its owners. Penrose walked with them, occasionally offering clarifications or answering Holmes's short, pointed questions. Yet the further they progressed into the interior of the building, the more Watson noticed a subtle change in Penrose's demeanor. By the time they returned to the small office for Penrose, the man's composure, tenuous at best, began to show the strain. Holmes settled himself near the window of the crossing one leg over the other with deliberate care. "Before we proceed further, Mr. Penrose," he said, removing his gloves with slow precision, "is a matter of confidentiality we must address." Penrose, already pale, seemed to pale further at the ring. He took a seat opposite Holmes, resting his elbows on, and steepled his hands. "I assume," Holmes continued, his tone low but clear, "that you've given considerable thought to the potential repercussions should word of this theft become public?" Penrose's shoulders visibly sagged. "Mr. Holmes, I have thought of little else." Watson, who had taken a seat near the door, kept his gaze on their client. There was a tremor in Penrose's voice now, not the tremor of fear, but of a man caught between duty and desperation. "This establishment," Penrose said carefully, choosing each word like a surgeon, making incisions, "has been in my family for nearly 4 decades. We have built a reputation among clients, among collectors, among, well, those whose names I would not care to speak aloud." Holmes nodded with faint understanding. The London elite were frequent clients of discreet jewelers. Matters like this, if revealed, could cause tremors far beyond Southwark. Continued, lowering his voice. "No one else outside the room. If the newspapers get hold of this, if Scotland Yard begins making inquiry, there will be consequence. Clients will withdraw their business. Our suppliers will grow wary. My competitors will feast upon the scandal. And yet," Holmes said mildly, "you've chosen to involve me, a decision that, by its nature, introduces risk." Penrose allowed himself the briefest flicker of a smile, though it was thin and exhausted. "You are, Mr. Holmes, the exception, a private investigator with a record of discretion, known for resolving matters quietly and efficiently." Holmes's lips curved slightly, barely a smile, but enough to indicate appreciation for the compliment. Watson spoke then, his voice gentle but deliberate. "You understand, Mr. Penrose, that our ability to help depends on full transparency. If there are sensitive elements, matters you'd prefer not to disclose, it would be unwise to withhold them." Penrose nodded quickly. "You'll have my full cooperation, whatever you require." Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to a small side table where a decanter of brandy rested alongside a pair of crystal glasses. "Do you drink, Mr. Penrose?" Already pouring a modest measure. Penrose hesitated, then nodded with quiet gratitude. "This morning, I think it would be welcome." Holmes handed him the glass, but took none for himself. While Penrose sipped, Holmes returned to his chair and opened a slender notebook from his coat pocket. He spoke while writing, his voice even, methodical. "Let us establish a few preliminary facts," he began. "Aside from yourself, only Miss Clarissa Penrose and Mr. Edwin Larchmere knew the vault's combination, correct?" "Yes." "And Mr. Wiggins, though not privy to the combination, is solely responsible for the maintenance of the locking mechanism. Holmes made a quick note. How frequently is the mechanism serviced? Once, without fail. And when was the last maintenance? Down the brandy glass. Thinking carefully. Just under 4 weeks ago. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Performed by Mr. Wiggins alone? Holmes paused in his writing. And no external technicians? No assistants? No apprentices? None. Watson leaned forward slightly. Has there been any unusual activity in the building these past weeks? Any repairs, visitors, deliveries out of the ordinary? Penrose shook his head. Nothing at all. Holmes flipped the notebook closed, tucking it back into his coat with slow, deliberate movements. Mr. Penrose, he said at last, before I meet with your niece and Mr. Kempfus, Larchmere, I'd like to inspect the vault interior, every inch of it. Will you grant me that liberty? Of course, Penrose. Whatever you need. Holmes stood, reaching for his hat and glove. One more thing, Holmes added, pausing at. During our investigation, I would advise that you tell no one of our involvement, not even Miss Penrose or Mr. Larchmere, until I've spoken with them myself. Let them believe the matter remains under internal review for now. Penrose blinked, surprised, but after a moment nodded. As you wish. With that, Holmes turned, signaling Watson to follow. They stepped back into the corridor, the muffled hum of the shop faint beyond the office walls. As they walked slowly toward the vault room again, Holmes spoke quietly to Watson, his voice low enough to avoid carrying. Observe his hands. Watson raised an eyebrow. Penrose's? Yes. The man has handled gemstones his entire career. His hands, though well kept, tremble far too much for mere anxiety. Something else burdens him. Holmes paused at the end of the hallway, glancing back toward the closed door of Penrose's office. And mark my words, he added with quiet conviction, this case will require far more than routine deduction. With that, Holmes moved forward, his coat trailing behind him as they returned toward the vault and the mystery it held. The rain outside continued its steady whisper, as if London itself were listening, waiting for the inevitable unraveling of secrets. The rain showed no sign of letting up as Holmes and Watson made their way back toward the front of the building, guided by Penrose through the modest maze of polished woodwork and narrow passageways that defined Penrose and Larchmere Jewelers. It was a quiet establishment, as if the building itself shared in its owner's nervous restraint. The very air seemed conditioned to hush footsteps and muffle voices, encouraging discretion at every turn. Even the electric bell above the main entrance, which should have chimed cheerfully with each opening of the door, was muted to a dull, almost apologetic tone, another silent testament to the kind of clientele this place served. Now standing once again in the front showroom, Holmes paused, letting his gaze wander with deliberate slow. The interior of the shop was modest but undeniably tasteful. Shelves lined the walls in symmetrical order, filled with understated displays of gold, pearl, sapphire, and other gems carefully arranged under spotless glass. The flooring was a polished dark wood that reflected the soft glow of the gas lamps, each lamp fitted with frosted shades to reduce glare and preserve the warm, subdued atmosphere that seemed to envelop the entire shop like a comforting fog. There was a feeling here, a carefully cultivated ambient of trust, secrecy, and quiet. Watson found himself instinctively lowering his voice as he spoke, matching the energy of the room. You've done well here, Mr. Penrose, he's nodding toward the display cases. I can see why you wish to avoid scandal. Penrose managed a tight smile, though the anxiety hadn't left his face. Our reputation is built on subtlety, Dr. Watson. Our clients expect not only quality, but privacy. Many of our sales never leave paper records. Holmes, already at the far wall, knelt to inspect the skirting board along the floor beneath one of the cabinets. With one gloved hand, he ran a finger along the corner seam, then paused to examine a nearly invisible hairline crack in the woodwork. New joinery here, Holmes murmured, almost to himself. Penrose stepped closer, frowning. Yes, some minor repairs done last month. The wood had begun to warp from a leak near the ceiling. But that's hardly relevant to... Holmes raised a hand gently, signaling for silence. He continued to inspect the lower panels for another full minute, before rising to his feet and brushing a small speck of dust. Watson watched all of this with growing curiosity. It was often during such small, quiet moments, Holmes inspecting the apparently insignificant, that the doctor felt the first stirrings of real anticipation for what lay ahead. A sudden movement from the rear of the showroom interrupted them. A young woman appeared at the archway, leading toward the back offices. Watson turned as Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. The woman was in her mid-20s, poised, elegantly dressed in a dark blue walking suit with a high collar and subtle lace detailing. Her hair, a rich auburn, was pulled back in a tidy chignon, revealing a face both composed and intelligent. Her expression held a mix of curiosity and caution. "Clarissa," Penrose said quickly, moving toward her, with a nervous glance over his shoulder at Holmes and Watson. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. They are assisting me with a private matter." Clarissa Penrose nodded politely but didn't step forward. Her gaze fixed on Holmes with quiet calculation, reading him the way Watson had seen Holmes so often read others. "I see," she said simply. "Well, sir, if there's anything I can do to assist, Uncle." Her voice was steady, but Watson detected the faintest edge of something. Uncertainty? Suspicion? Holmes inclined his head in a slow, respectful acknowledgment. "Miss Penrose," he said softly, "your uncle's concerns are entirely justified. For now, I will only ask that you continue your duties as usual. I will request your time shortly." Clarissa gave a single nod, then disappeared back through the archway, her footsteps light and controlled. Holmes watched her departure with the faintest of smiles at the corners of his mouth. "She observes more than she lets on," Holmes remarked when she was out of view. Penrose exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. "Clarissa, she's loyal to the family, but she's also strong-willed. She doesn't like Holmes offered a "Neither do I, Mr. Fortunately, mine are usually short-lived." Holmes's attention returned to the layout of the shop. Slowly, he began to walk the length of the showroom, pausing at the heavy counter where transactions took place. The countertop was immaculately clean, its surface polished to a mirror shine. A brass bell sat at one end, gleaming and free of fingerprints. Behind the counter, an entry to the back room stood open, revealing a glimpse of ledger books and wooden cabinets where account records were likely stored. Holmes passed through without hesitation. Inside, the office space was compact but functional. Rows of neatly labeled ledgers, a locked filing cabinet, and 2 chairs arranged for client consultations. On a small side table sat a half-empty cup of tea, still faintly warm to the touch. Watson made a note of the temperature when Holmes gestured for him to check it. "She was here recently," indicating the cup, possibly reviewing documents before our arrival. They returned to the main showroom where Holmes took one final. "The vault," Holmes said, turning back, "is secure. The external entrances are locked. No signs of no disturbances in the woodwork save that." Penrose nodded quickly. "Exactly. That's why I called this impossible." Holmes stepped toward the door but paused with one hand on the frame. "Nothing," he said softly, "is impossible, Mr. Penrose. Only undiscovered." With that, Holmes turned back toward the private offices, signaling Watson with a subtle glance. "Now," Holmes said under his breath, "let us meet Mr. Larchmere." And as the detective moved down the hall, the air inside Penrose and Larchmere seemed to shift, charged now with that quiet tension that always came when Holmes began peeling back the first layers of a carefully concealed truth. Outside, the rain persisted, soaking the cobblestones as if the city itself were holding its. The rain outside deepened into a steady curtain, draping Southwark in a muted, almost ghostly light. The gas lamps along the street burned low, their pale halos blurred against the misted windows of Penrose and Larchmere jewelers. Inside, the air felt heavier now, charged with the early gravity of investigation. Holmes stood just inside the threshold of the vault room, perfectly relaxed, but his gaze roving over the features of the vault door as though he were reading an unfamiliar language written in steel. The vault itself dominated the space, its presence both practical and monolithic. The door stood nearly 7 feet tall, its brushed metal finish unmarred by scratches or dents. The Swiss locking mechanism was a marvel of engineering, an array of concentric brass dials, numbered wheels, and tiny levers set flush into the steel. It gleamed even in the low light, the mechanical artistry of Zurich's finest craftsmen. Watson, who had seen many forms of security in his time as a medical officer and later during cases with Holmes, had to admit this was something extraordinary. Holmes removed his gloves with uncharacteristic slowness, folding them neatly and placing them in the coat pocket. Without asking for permission, he crouched down before the lock, bringing his face level with the intricate assembly. His fingertips hovered just above the mechanisms, careful not to make direct contact. "The precision here," Holmes murmured, speaking more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "This isn't a mere safe, it's a timepiece, a symphony of cogs, springs, and pressure gauges, carefully calibrated over years." Penrose stood just behind Watson, visibly nervous. He shifted from foot to foot, twisting his wedding band with a distracted thumb. "Mr. Holmes, I assure you, the mechanism has been maintained meticulously. Mr. Wiggins, he's been with us nearly a decade. No one knows the workings of this lock." Holmes's head tilted slightly at the mention of Wiggins. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small magnifying, the one Watson had seen him use countless times during crime scene examinations. With methodical care, Holmes leaned closer to the dial, inspecting the faint scratches left by years of human touch. His movements were slow, calculated, though listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. After several minutes of silent study, he rose fluidly to his... "The lock," Holmes said, turning now to face both Watson and Penrose, "shows no sign of recent tampering. No fresh scratches near the dials, no tool marks along the seams, not even the faint scuffs I would expect from a poorly executed picking attempt." Watson nodded, jotting a few notes in his small, leather-bound book. "So, it wasn't forced." "Not from the exterior," Holmes agreed, "but as with most mechanisms, the vulnerability often lies within." Holmes approached the far wall where a small floor-to-ceiling shelving unit held maintenance ledgers, repair records, and catalogs for vault servicing. Without waiting for instruction, he began leafing through the records with brisk efficiency. Each ledger entry was marked with clean, elegant handwriting. Holmes paused over the pending maintenance schedules, pausing only when he reached the entries related to Mr. Wiggins. 4 weeks ago, last maintenance performed, duration of visit, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Penrose, standard time frame. Mr. Wiggins always prefers to work alone during maintenance, says it helps him concentrate on the gears and tensioning. Holmes closed the ledger with understandable, but curious. Holmes turned his attention now to the inner workings of the vault. He requested that Penrose open the door for a full interior inspection. Penrose hesitated for the brief and almost imperceptible pause that Holmes did not miss before crossing the room to the combination. Watson, as Penrose manipulated of numbers, soft clicking of tumblers echoed in each subtle rotation falling into place. Finally, with a deep metallic sigh, the heavy door unlocked. With effort, Penrose swung the door open, revealing the vault's interior. The air inside was noticeably cooler. The walls were lined with reinforced steel panels, and the floor was covered in dark felt to prevent jewelry cases from slipping or cracking. Shelves ran along 3 sides, holding locked boxes, velvet trays, and small reinforced cabinets for individual pieces. At the center sat a recessed alcove where the Royal Sapphire of Kashmir had once rested. The space was conspicuously empty now, like a missing tooth in a perfect smile. Holmes stepped forward with slow, deliberate movement. He inspected the alcove, running his gloved fingertips along the edge, checking for hidden seams or loose panels. Watson stood at the threshold, noting every angle Holmes investigated. There was no sign of disturbance, no scratches, no dust displacement, not even a single fingerprint in the thin layer of residue that often settled in such places over time. Holmes knelt, examining the floor of the alcove. Then, with practiced subtlety, he lowered his face until it was just inches from the felt line. A few seconds passed. Then Holmes froze. Watson, recognizing the change in Holmes's breathing and posture, stepped closer. "What is it?" Watson asked. Holmes reached into his pocket for a small steel probe. a slender, precise tool he often carried for delicate examinations. He used it to trace the seam along the back panel of the alcove, applying the faintest pressure, a whisper of resistance. Holmes's eyes lit with sudden focus. He pulled a small brass hinge pick from his pocket and inserted it near the seam, applying gentle leverage. The panel didn't move, but Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "Watson, have a look here. See this faint line?" Watson knelt beside. Indeed, there was a nearly invisible groove, perhaps less than a millimeter wide, running horizontally along the back wall of the. Unless one were specifically searching for it, it would remain unnoticed. Holmes tapped the edge of the panel lightly with his knuckle, producing a hollow tone beneath the otherwise solid steel. A false panel. At least, that is my suspicion. Penrose, standing several feet back, paled at the revelation. A false panel? That's impossible. The vault was custom built. No additional compartments exist. I was present during its installation. Holmes rose, turning toward Penrose with a patient, almost gentle expression. "Then, perhaps, Mr. Penrose, the vault you ordered is not precisely the vault you received." Watson stood slowly, understanding dawning as he considered the implication. Holmes adjusted his cuffs and stepped back, giving the space one final glance. "We'll need specialized tools," Holmes said. "I won't risk damaging the mechanism until I've studied the full schematics of this model. Please arrange for the service diagrams from your Swiss manufacturer, and have Mr. Wiggins present himself at Baker Street tomorrow morning. I wish to speak with him before I speak to anyone else." Penrose opened his mouth as if to object, but then closed it again, nodding with reluctant. Holmes turned, signaling to Watson that their work here, for today, was done. As they stepped back into the cool, mist-heavy street outside, Holmes paused briefly under the shop's awning. He pulled on his gloves with slow precision, his mind already several steps ahead. Watson said nothing as they entered their waiting cab, knowing Holmes well enough to recognize that a theory, partial but forming, was already taking shape behind his friend's calm expression. As the cab pulled away from the curb, the wet streets of Southwark stretched behind them like a blurred trail of unanswered. The afternoon light had thinned into a pale gray by the time Holmes and Watson returned to Baker. The air inside their sitting room felt warmer in contrast to the damp chill that clung to their coats, but Holmes didn't pause to warm himself by the fire, as he sometimes did after a long morning of investigation. Instead, he went directly to his writing desk, pushing aside a stack of neglected correspondence and pulling a sheet of fresh paper from the drawer. With swift, economical movements, he drafted a short note requesting that Mr. Wiggins present himself at Baker Street the following morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Once the letter was sealed and set aside for Mrs. Hudson to send by courier, Holmes finally turned to Watson, who had settled into the armchair nearest the hearth. "Tea, Holmes?" Watson asked, already reaching for the pot that Mrs. Hudson had brought in anticipation of their return. Holmes gave the faintest nod of gratitude but did not sit. Instead, he moved toward the window where the rain had started again with renewed persistence, tracing long, meandering paths down the glass. Watson watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're already forming a theory, aren't you?" Holmes's answer came slowly, as though each word were selected from a larger collection of thoughts still in progress. "Not yet a theory, Watson, but possibilities. The vault speaks of precision, of calculation. And yet, the crime itself leaves no fingerprint, no visible method, no trace. That sort of contradiction rarely occurs by accident." Before Watson could press further, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Hudson appeared an instant later, holding a small calling card on a silver tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes. The young lady from the jeweler's shop. She's downstairs now." Holmes raised an eye. "Miss Clarissa Penrose?" "Yes, sir." Holmes took the card and glanced at it briefly, though he already knew her name. Without hesitation, he instructed Mrs. Hudson to show her in. Moments later, Clarissa Penrose entered the sitting room, her composure as carefully assembled as when they'd first seen her that morning. She wore a long gray overcoat, still damp at the hem, and carried a small leather satchel tucked beneath her arm. Watson stood, offering her a seat near the fire. Clarissa accepted it with a quiet word of thanks, her gloved hands resting carefully in her lap. Holmes remained standing by the window for a few moments longer, studying her through the reflection in the glass, before finally turning and joining them. "Miss Penrose," he said, lowering himself into the armchair opposite hers, "I admit I did not expect to see you so soon." Clarissa offered a small, apologetic smile. "I hope I'm not imposing, Mr. But after your visit to the shop this morning, I found it difficult to sit and wait." Her voice, though soft, carried a calm strength, a quiet determination that Watson found. Holmes folded his hands loosely in his lap. "Please, tell me what brings you here." Clarissa hesitated for a brief moment, glancing toward Watson as if weighing how much to reveal in the presence of a second list. But after a breath she continued, her gaze steady. "It's about something I heard 2 days ago. The morning before the Sapphire was discovered missing." Holmes said nothing, waiting patiently to elaborate. Clarissa adjusted her gloves, her fingers moving with deliberate care. "I arrived at the that day, as I usually do. I was in the showroom, going over the previous day's receipts. Around 8:30, I heard something unusual." Watson leaned forward. "What sort of sound?" Clarissa's brow furrowed in a ticking noise, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the vault. Holmes's gaze sharpened, but his posture remained relaxed. "A ticking sound, like the inner workings of a clock?" Clarissa nodded. "Yes, not loud, not constant either. It lasted perhaps 10-15 seconds. Then it stopped." "Had you heard it before?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "Never." "Did anyone else mention hearing it?" "No one else was in that part of the building at the..." Holmes pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin, eyes narrowing with thought. "Did Mr. Wiggins happen to be present that day?" Clarissa paused. "No, at least not that I'm aware of. His visits for maintenance are always scheduled, and I didn't see him that." Holmes's gaze drifted toward the fireplace. He processed this new detail. "And you dismissed the sound at the time?" Clarissa's expression softened off reproach. "I did. I thought perhaps it was something minor, one of the small desks or the building settling." Watson, ever the kindly observer, offered a reassurance. "Most people wouldn't think twice about it." Holmes, however, remained silent for several seconds. Then, rising slowly he crossed to the corner table, where he kept a small collection of mechanical samples, clock gears, springs, and lock components, collected over years of study. He selected a tiny brass gear and held it between his fingers, rolling it thoughtfully across his knuckles as he spoke again. "Miss Penrose," he said quietly, "your decision to come here, to share this detail, was wise." Clarissa seemed to relax slightly. Holmes turned back toward her. "I would ask that you continue to observe carefully. If anything at all, strikes you as unusual, whether a sound, a smell, or even a change in the air, I want to be informed immediately." Clarissa nodded. "Of course." Holmes's gaze softened then, the sharpness in his expression giving way to something almost reassuring. "I have found, Miss Penrose, that it is often the smallest detail, the ones most easily dismissed, that unravel the most intricate of mystery." Clarissa stood, smoothing her coat with practiced grace. "Thank you, Holmes. Dr. Watson." Watson rose as well, offering a polite bow of the head as Holmes escorted her to the door. Once she was gone, and Mrs. Hudson had closed the door behind her, Holmes lingered at the window, watching as Clarissa disappeared down Baker Street, her figure soon swallowed by the mist and rain. Watson waited, knowing better than to interrupt Holmes's quiet thinking. Finally Holmes spoke, his voice low but filled with new weight. "A ticking sound," he murmured, "from a vault that should contain nothing but silence." Holmes turned toward stoking the embers with slow, deliberate movement. "Watson," he said at last, "I believe our clockmaker may soon provide us with answers, whether he intends to or not." And with that, Holmes fell silent once more, his mind already drifting several steps ahead of the conversation just had, assembling invisible pieces of a puzzle whose edges were beginning, just barely, to take shape. The rain continued outside, steady and patient, like time itself, waiting. The following morning dawned with little improvement in the weather. The mist hung low over London, thickening as the hour approached 10 o'clock. Holmes, already dressed and at his writing desk, leafed through several correspondences while keeping one ear trained on the clock above the mantel. Watson, seated near the fire with a copy of the Times, occasionally glanced at the door, awaiting the arrival of Mr. Wiggins as previously arranged. But it wasn't Wiggins who arrived first. At precisely 9:30, well ahead of schedule, another visitor was announced. Mrs. Hudson's soft knock was followed by her familiar voice. "Mr. Edwin Larchmere to see you, Mr. Holmes." Watson's eyes rose at the name. Holmes, without looking, said only, "Show him in." When Larchmere entered, it became immediately apparent that this was a man accustomed to control, both over himself and likely others. He was impeccably dressed in a dark three-piece suit, tailored within an inch of precision. His boots were polished to a mirror sheen, and his hair, salt and pepper at the temples, was brushed back with methodical care. A silver pocket watch chain hung across his waistcoat with understated elegance. His face, however, was the true study, a sharply angled jaw, eyes slightly narrowed as if in perpetual evaluation of others, and a mouth that seemed to hold its expressions in reserve, as though carefully rationed. Holmes stood slowly and gestured to the armchair opposite him. "Mr. Larchmere," he said evenly. A surprise, but not unwelcome. Larchmere inclined his head with polite detachment, but did not immediately sit. Instead, he moved toward the fireplace, gazing into the coals with an air of studied nonchalance. "I presume," he began, his tone clipped and controlled, "that I need no elaborate explanation for the nature of your involvement with my business." Holmes offered a small smile, devoid. "Mr. Penrose has been candid, if not entirely thorough, but I gather that's why you're here." Larchmere turned, folding his arms. "I dislike surprises, Miss. I dislike them immensely. Imagine my dismay when I learned secondhand that a private detective had been brought into a matter that could easily have been managed internally." Watson watched the exchange carefully. Larchmere's every word was deliberate, measured for effect, but there was tension in the set of his shoulders, a tightly controlled coil beneath the polished exterior. Holmes settled back into his chair, his expression one of mild amusement. "And yet, here you are." Larchmere allowed himself a thin smile, more an act of courtesy than sincerity. "I thought it best we meet before assumptions are made." Holmes gestured with one hand. "By all means, Mr. Larchmere, sit. Let's avoid the fatigue of indirect conversation." Reluctantly, Larchmere lowered himself into the chair. Once seated, he crossed one leg over the other and removed a pair of gloves with slow precision. "I was in Brighton during the time of the alleged disappearance," he said, emphasizing the word alleged. "I had business at the Royal Albion Hotel, meetings with clients. I've already provided Mr. Penrose with receipts and references to confirm my whereabouts." Holmes gave no indication of doubt or, "I will, of course, be verifying all such details personally," Larchmere offered it. Naturally, there was a pause. Watson watched as Holmes allowed the silence to grow, a familiar tactic. Larchmere shifted only slightly in his seat, but betrayed no more. Holmes eventually broke the stillness, the casual question. "And what is your personal theory, Mr. Larchmere, about the missing sapphire?" Larchmere hesitated, just long enough for Holmes to notice, before speaking with rehearsed calm. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the explanation lies within human weakness. Someone within our circle may have made a poor decision under pressure, a moment of greed, perhaps an act of desperation." Holmes' gaze narrowed just slightly. "An interesting choice of words. You speak of our circle. That limits your suspicion to Miss Penrose or your business partner." Larchmere's mouth curved in something resembling a smile, though no humor reached his eyes. "You are the detective, Mr. I leave the narrowing of suspects to you." Watson noted the careful deflection. Not a direct accusation, but not an exoneration either. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but precise. "Tell me, how would you describe your relationship with Miss Penrose?" Another pause. "Fractional, but there." "Professional," Larchmere replied at last. "She's competent, organized, devoted to her uncle and the family business." Watson caught the faint shift in Holmes's posture, the way he filed away Larchmere's every micro-expression. Holmes smiled faintly, folding his hands together. "And with Mr. Wiggins?" Larchmere's lips tightened. "An adequate mechanic, Skilled, yes, but increasingly unreliable in his habits. There have been instances of tardiness, a tendency to linger longer than necessary hours. I've raised the matter with Mr. Penrose more. Drinking? Holmes asked. No, Larchmere answered quickly. At least, not to my knowledge. But there's something about him lately. Restlessness, irritability, unfinished work left on the bench. Holmes nodded slowly, making a mental note of the observation. After a brief silence, Holmes rose, signaling the conversation's close. Thank you for your candor, Mr. As I mentioned, I'll be verifying your time in Brighton. In the meantime, I trust you'll remain available. Larchmere stood, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket with slow, controlled movement. I'm not in the habit of fleeing. With a final glance toward Watson, Larchmere crossed the room, collected his gloves and hat, and departed without another word. Watson waited until the door clicked shut before speaking. Well, charming fellow. Holmes allowed himself a rare, genuine cold water in human form, he said. But useful, Watson, extremely useful. Watson set down his paper. You believe him? I believe, Holmes said softly, that Mr. Larchmere is a man far more concerned with perception than truth. Whether that makes him a suspect or merely an obstacle remains to be seen. Holmes moved to the window, watching Larchmere's figure into the morning. And now, Holmes said after a moment, turning back toward the center of the room, we wait for will prove far more interest. The clock on the mantel had begun striking 10 when Mrs. Hudson reappeared at the door, her voice low but marked with an undercurrent of curiosity she rarely allowed herself to show. Mr. Wiggins is here for you. Holmes, already standing near the fireplace with a small notebook in hand, gave a single nod. Please show him in. Watson, seated nearby with a cup of tea, closed his notebook and placed it on the side table, setting his full attention on the arrival of their next guest. The door opened wider, and in stepped Mr. Wiggins. The man was shorter than Watson had expected, stooped slightly, with the kind of thin, wiry build that suggested a life spent hunched over workbenches and mechanical contraptions. His clothes were simple but carefully pressed. A dark brown coat with faint traces of old machine oil near the cuff, a gray waistcoat with frayed edges and neatly mended Yet it was his hands that drew Holmes's immediate attention. Long-fingered, pale, and marked with fine scars and calluses. Hands that spoke of decades spent working with gears, springs, and tools no larger than a needle's eye. There was also something else, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand. Wiggins wore a jeweler's lens clipped to his collar, as though he had come directly from his workbench. The lens hung there like a forgotten accessory, a badge of his trade. His face, lined with, held the look of a man, someone whose I'm listening, his eye pale gray, and moving from Holmes to Watson, then back to the corner of the room, as if taking silent inventory of his surrounding. Holmes gestured to the chair near Mr. Wiggins. Thank you for coming. Wiggins hesitated for the briefest of moments before moving to sit. His movements were deliberate but slow, as though each action was measured against some internal caution. Once seated, he cleared his throat quietly and adjusted his coat sleeve, though he made no move to remove his gloves. Holmes seated himself across from, hands steepled beneath his chin. I trust you are aware, Holmes began in a tone both calm and deliberate, that Mr. Penrose has engaged my services in a matter of considerable delicacy. Wiggins nodded once, not meeting Holmes's yes, sir, he told me. Said you'd likely want to ask me some questions. Watson watched. The man's voice was low but steady, carrying the worn timbre of someone accustomed to giving short, factual answers and little more. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on him. Let us begin with the obvious. When did you last perform maintenance on the vault mechanism? 4 weeks ago, Wiggins replied quickly. Standard quarterly service. No issues reported at the time. Holmes tapped one finger lightly against the armrest of his chair. Did you conduct the maintenance alone? Wiggins's eyes flicked toward Holmes, then back to the floor. All was due. The vault's interior components, delicate work, sir. Too many hands only make trouble. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And you were given uninterrupted time? Yes, as usual. 2 hours and some change. Watson noted the phrasing. casual but accurate to the minute. Holmes shifted the conversation slightly. Have you noticed anything unusual about the mechanism in the weeks following your service? Any noises, delays, irregularities? Wiggins hesitated just long enough for Holmes to know. Well, he said slowly, choosing his words, not from the vault itself, sir. But, Holmes prompted gently. Wiggins cleared his throat again. I did hear something odd last week. Day after I came by to check the shop's front display clocks. Thought it was nothing at the time. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Describe it? A ticking, Wiggins said, lowering his, though reluctant, faint, from the vault area. Only lasted a few seconds. Watson exchanged a quick glance with Holmes. Clarissa's account now corroborated. Holmes's tone remained perfectly neutral. And did you investigate? No, sir. Wiggins's shoulders tightened. Figured it was just settling. The building's old, floorboards, pipes, that sort of thing. Holmes let the pause stretch, watching the older man closely. And tell me, Mr. Wiggins, he said at last, have you ever, during any of your maintenance sessions, made any modifications to the vault mechanism that were not part of its original design? Wiggins's head shot up, and for the first time since entering the room, real color flushed into his face. No, sir, he sudden force. Absolutely not. I'm a mechanic, Mr. Holmes, not a criminal. I wouldn't dare, not with something like that. Yeah. Holmes remained silent for a beat, letting the air grow heavier. Of course, Holmes said finally, his voice light again, but surely, over the years you've had ideas, small improvements, tiny adjustments that might make your job easier, or perhaps more interesting. Wiggins's gaze dropped again. Sir, I maintain what I'm paid to maintain, nothing more. Watson watched him carefully. The denial came quickly, but not convincingly. Holmes rose, walking slowly toward the fireplace, hands clasped. One final question for now, Mr. Wiggins, he said without turning around. Have you noticed any change, Mr. Larchmere or Miss Penrose? Any unusual behaviors, absences, inconsistencies? Wiggins shifted again in his seat. Miss Clarissa, no, sir. Always proper, always polite. And Larchmere? A longer pause. Wiggins scratched at the back of his neck. He's been colder than usual, distant, keeps to himself more. But then, he's always been nothing I'd call strange. Not by his standards, Holmes nodded as if expecting the answer. Thank you, Mr. Wiggins. That will be all for today. Please make yourself available over the next few days. I may have further questions. Wiggins stood, adjusting his coat with shaky fingers. Of course, sir. As the door closed behind him, Watson exhaled slowly. Well, Holmes, what do you make of him? Holmes remained silent for several seconds, staring into the... Finally, he turned, his eyes bright with controlled interest. Watson, we've just spoken with a man carrying a lock like a clock, wound too tight. Holmes smiled faintly. The question now is when he'll break. And with that, Holmes returned to his chair, already reaching for... As the faint sound of rain once again resumed its steady whisper, the hours following Mr. Wiggins's departure in an unusual, even for... Holmes spent much of the late morning and early afternoon seated near the window, his gaze fixed not on the street outside, but on some invisible point far beyond it, deep within the intricate workings of his own mind. Watson, recognizing the mood, knew better than to interrupt. He busied himself with medical journals and correspondence, occasionally stealing glances toward Holmes whenever the detective's fingers drummed absently on the arm of his chair, or when his eyes narrowed at some private conclusion. By 2:30, Holmes finally stirred from his seat. He stood stretched with feline grace and crossed to the cabinet near the fireplace, a small collection of investigative tools, magnifying glasses, measuring calipers, a vial or two for chemical samples, and, of particular note today, a set of delicate steel tweezers. Without a word, he slipped the tweezers into his coat pocket, followed by a small glass vial lined with cotton. Watson looked up from his reading. Going out? Watson asked. Holmes, already donning his coat, paused to adjust his collar. Back to Southwark, he said. There's something I want to examine, something I should have noticed sooner. Watson stood. I'll come with you. Holmes's gaze softened slightly. Your company is always welcome. They left Baker Street under a sky that hung heavy. The air had taken on that distinctive London dampness, a smell of wet stone and coal smoke, of horse sweat and distant river fall. The cab ride passed mostly in silence, punctuated only by Holmes's occasional observation of the state of the streets, the way certain shops had changed their displays since their last visit, the peculiar pattern of soot on a row of brick facades near Blackfriars. When they arrived at Penrose and Larchmere Jewelers, Mr. Penrose himself greeted them at the door, his face tight with concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I hadn't expected you today." Holmes offered a brief nod. "I'm here for a closer inspection of the vault. Alone, if you please." Penrose hesitated, visibly torn between curiosity and trust. Finally, he nodded. "Of course. I'll see that you're not disturbed." Holmes and Watson proceeded directly to the vault room. The air inside was cool as before, the steel walls reflecting the dim gaslight from a single overhead fixture. Holmes knelt at the vault's interior alcove, where the Royal Sapphire of Kashmir had once rested. Without rushing, he removed the tweezers from his pocket and began a methodical examination of the space. He worked in silence for several minutes, probing the felt lining, examining the seams, lifting small sections of fabric, and inspecting every angle with the precision of a surgeon. Then, just as Watson began to wonder whether this trip would yield anything new, Holmes froze. He leaned closer to the back corner of the alcove, so close that his nose was nearly touching. With practiced care, he slid the tweezers into the narrowest part of the seam near the rear wall. Watson stepped closer. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer him. Instead, with a surgeon's steadiness, he drew the tweezers back, holding them up for nestled delicately between the jaws of the no larger than the tip of a matchstick, of brilliant, unmistakable. Watson leaned in, adjusting his spectacles for a better look. A piece of sapphire. Good Lord. Holmes carefully placed the tiny shard into the glass vial, sealing it with a practice of the stopper. "It's no coincidence," Holmes said quietly. "No natural fracture. This wasn't the result of careless handling or accident." Watson frowned. "Then how—" Holmes rose to his feet, dusting off his knees. "A sliver like this doesn't simply appear at the rear of a vault alcove, not with a gemstone of that size. No, this is the residue of a mechanical process, something that involved pressure, motion, perhaps even concealment." Watson absorbed the words, his mind already conjuring images of gears turning, panels shifting, hidden compartments sliding open. Holmes crossed the room, inspecting the floor for any sign of dust trails, disturbed fibers in the carpet. His gaze paused on the skirting board, the air vents, even the hinges of the vault door. "I want to see Mr. Wiggins's workshop," at last, straightening. "At once." Watson, his workshop? Holmes's eyes glittered with quiet intensity. "If the answers aren't in the vault, they'll be in the tools used to build it." As they left the vault room and crossed through the shop, Clarissa Penrose appeared near the display case. She said nothing, but her gaze lingered on Holmes as he, sharp, questioning, almost hopeful. Holmes paused only briefly to tip his hat in acknowledgement before continuing toward the door. Outside, the rain had resumed, gentler now but persistent, falling in thin streams down the narrow gutters of Southwark. Holmes pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the waiting cab with Watson at his side. "Southwark's clockmaker district," Holmes instructed the driver. "At once." As the cab lurched forward, Holmes leaned back against the worn leather seat, holding the small glass vial up to the dim light filtering through the rain-smeared window. The tiny sliver of sapphire caught the gray light, flashing blue for the briefest moment before Holmes pocketed it again. "The stone has spoken, Watson," Holmes said softly. "Now, let's hear what Mr. Wiggins's tools have to say." And with that, they disappeared once more into the wet London street, chasing answers that now seemed closer, yet more elusive than ever. The cab rolled steadily through the narrow streets of Southwark, the wheels splashing through shallow puddles formed by the persistent autumn rain. The air inside the vehicle hung heavy with damp wool, and the faint smell of coal smoke carried in from the city outside. Holmes sat with his eyes closed, fingertips lightly pressed together beneath his chin, the small glass vial containing the sapphire fragment resting safely in his inner coat pocket. Watson, seated opposite, observed his friend in silence. He had seen Holmes in this state before, utterly still on the outside, but internally in furious motion, calculating, hypothesizing, eliminating, reassembling each piece of the puzzle like a chess master several moves ahead. After several blocks, Holmes opened his eyes and leaned forward, tapping the driver's panel sharply. "Corner of Bellyard and Tanner Street," he instructed. The driver nodded without looking back, adjusting the reins as the horse picked up speed. Watson tilted his "Bellyard? I wasn't aware Mr. Wiggins kept his workshop there." Holmes offered a faint smile. "Few are, Watson, even among clockmakers. Mr. Wiggins operates quietly." Within minutes, the cab drew to a stop in front of an unassuming brick building squeezed between a shuttered tailor shop and a tobacconist's. The exterior bore no sign, no painted lettering on the glass, only a small brass plate near the door with a single word, etched discreetly, "Horology." Holmes stepped down first, pausing only briefly beneath the overhang to survey the narrow alleyway beside the building. His eyes lingered on the gutter running along the side wall, noting the accumulation of fine debris and fragments of metal near the drainage pipe. Watson followed as Holmes pushed open the door. A small brass bell gave a muted ring. The air inside smelled of oil, brass filings, and varnished wood. The space was dim, lit by two small oil lamps and a single narrow window along the rear wall that allowed little more than a sliver of gray daylight to enter. Work benches lined both sides of the room, each cluttered with precision tools, micro screwdrivers, gear pullers, tiny brushes, and magnifying. Open drawers revealed an assortment of springs, coils, and minuscule cogs sorted meticulously into wooden compartments. On the far wall hung an array of some grand, others small and delicate, each one in various states of assembly or disrepair. The collective ticking, out of sync and layered, filled the room with a soft, uneven rhythm like the heartbeat of some mechanical creature. Holmes moved slowly through the space, his eyes sweeping over each bench, each set of tools, each stray filing on the floor. Watson noticed several objects that struck him as curious. A disassembled carriage clock with unusually thick gears, a set of hollow brass rods of indeterminate use, and on one workbench near the window, what appeared to be the internal locking from a vault door, not from the Penrose shop, but certainly from a similar model. Holmes ran a finger along the edge of the plate, inspecting the fine scratch marks near one of the screw holes. Before Watson could ask, the door at the back of the workshop opened with a soft creak. Mr. Wiggins entered, wiping his hands on a stained rag, his face registering a mixture of surprise and thinly masked discomfort at seeing Holmes and Watson already inside. "Mr. Holmes," voice low, and "Dr. Watson, this is unexpected." Holmes turned with slow deliberation, offering a smile so faint it barely qualified as one. "You must forgive the intrusion, Mr. Wiggins. I'm afraid I don't wait well when curiosity strikes." Wiggins set the rag aside, moving to stand behind one of the benches as though placing a wall of tools between himself and his visitors. "Of course, though I must say, I wasn't expecting to entertain visitors today." Holmes gestured broadly to the space around them. "Your workshop is impressive, remarkably well equipped, and I notice quite a few vault components in various states of disassembly." Wiggins shrugged with forced casualness. "Most clockmakers avoid vault work, too intricate, but I've always had a fondness for mechanism of all kinds." Holmes nodded, taking a slow step closer to the workbench near the window. "Tell me, Mr. Wiggins," Holmes said, lifting a small brass gear between his fingertips, "have you ever modified one of your vault projects, adjusted something, improved upon it?" Wiggins's left hand twitched, the tremor more pronounced. "No more than routine maintenance. Small calibrations, cleaning, never structural changes." Holmes tilted his head. "Not even when you saw an opportunity to innovate?" There was a pause. Wiggins's eyes flickered toward a drawer at the far left side of the bench. Holmes noticed. Without waiting, Holmes crossed the floor and opened the drawer for Wiggins. Inside, nestled among standard clock parts, was a small collection of hand-forged metal plates, thin, narrow, and shaped with remarkable precision. Alongside them sat a series of tiny locking pins and a hand-drawn schematic, partially folded but unmistakably a cross-section of a vault interior. Holmes lifted the schematic carefully, unfolding it across the bench. Watson stepped closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder. It was a detailed drawing of the Penrose vault, a very close relative of, with annotations in Wiggins's own handwriting. At the bottom, barely lit, a small note: false base compartment, spring-loaded drop, concealed release via side gear. Shin's breath. Holmes smiled faintly, turning slowly toward Wiggins. The clockmaker's face had lost all its color. Before Holmes could speak, Wiggins raised a hand as though in surrender, but no words came from his. His gaze dropped to the floor, and he sank slowly onto the nearest stool, burying his face in trembling hands. Holmes folded the schematic with slow precision and tucked it into his coat. "We'll speak at length soon, Mr. Wiggins," Holmes said, "but for now, rest. I imagine you've been carrying this weight for some time." With that, Holmes nodded to and stepped toward, leaving the workshop heavy with, punctuated only by the ticking of unfinished. As they stepped back out into the cold air of Southwark, Watson glanced at Holmes. A hidden compartment. Good Lord. Holmes adjusted his collar against the rain. A hidden pathway, Watson, built with care, designed with patience, and now exposed. The rain intensified as they climbed into their waiting cab. Holmes settled into his seat, staring out at the gray city beyond. "The stone never left the vault," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It simply took a different path." Holmes remained unusually quiet during the cab ride back to Baker Street. The small glass vial containing the sapphire fragment rested safely in his coat pocket, and the folded schematic from Wiggins's drawer lay tucked beside. Watson, seated opposite, chose not to disturb his friend's thoughts. Years of companionship had taught him that Holmes's silences were often as productive as his question. The detective's eyes remained half-lidded, but Watson knew full well that his mind was moving rapidly, mapping out possibilities, examining motives, calculating probability. As the cab clattered over wet cobblestones, Holmes finally stirred, opening his eyes. "We'll return to Wiggins's workshop, but this time with full intent." Watson raised an eye. "Wasn't our last visit thorough enough?" "No, Watson. We looked, but we didn't see." By the time they reached Baker Street, Holmes was already drafting a short note for Mr. Penrose, requesting temporary custody of the vault's mechanical schematics, official detailed diagrams from the Swiss manufacturer. "I want to compare them line by line with Wiggins's modifications." There's a gap somewhere, a mechanical inconsistency. A man like Wiggins wouldn't risk a deception without a fail-safe. We need to find it." The afternoon slipped into early evening as the rain persisted, casting thin silver streaks across the window glass. At exactly 6 o'clock, Holmes stood from his chair and reached for his coat again. "Ready, Watson?" "Of course," Watson replied, already collecting his hat and gloves. Their second approach to Wiggins's workshop was less subtle than the first. Holmes knocked sharply twice in succession with a kind of authority that left no room for hesitation. Then the door creaked open. Wiggins stood there, paler than before, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. His shirt collar was unbuttoned, and the jeweler's lens that usually hung neatly from his waistcoat was missing. "Mr. Holmes?" he began, his voice low, and Holmes stepped past him without invitation. "We'll need access to your full bench today, Mr. Wiggins." "Everything, including your private storage." Wiggins hesitated. I don't know if that's..." Holmes turned sharply, fixing him with that narrow, penetrating gaze Watson had seen reduce stronger men to silence. "Mr. Wiggins," Holmes said quietly, "we are now beyond the luxury of negotiation." The workshop looked much as it had the day before, but Holmes moved with new purpose. He went first to the drawer, where he'd found the hidden schematic, pulling it open again and checking for additional papers. Finding none, he moved along the workbenches, inspecting every tray of tools, every compartment, every drawer that hadn't been opened during their previous. At one bench near the rear corner, Holmes paused. "Watson, look here." Watson stepped closer. In the corner of the room stood a tall, narrow cabinet, its woodwork different from the rest of the shop furniture. Where the other pieces were old and dark with age, this cabinet was newer, the wood lighter, and the locks far more modern. Holmes knelt before it, examining the keyhole. Then, turning to Wiggins, he extended an open hand. "The key, if you please." Wiggins's throat worked as he swallowed, but after a long pause, he produced a small brass key from his vest pocket and placed it reluctantly into Holmes's hand. The lock clicked open with a soft metallic sound. Inside were rows of small velvet-lined trays. Most held standard clock components: gears, mainsprings, balance wheel. But in the second drawer from the bottom, Holmes found something else entirely: a collection of custom machine plates, each no larger than a playing card, carefully wrapped in oiled paper. Alongside them lay several tiny spring-loaded pistons, what appeared to be a miniature control lever, complete with tension settings. Holmes lifted one of the plates with gloved fingers. The craftsmanship was immaculate. Watson leaned in. "Good Lord. Are these?" "Yes," Holmes confirmed. "False floor mechanisms, designed to drop, hold, and later retrieve." Holmes turned toward Wiggins, his tone calm but utterly without softness. "You engineered a concealed compartment inside the vault, Mr. Wiggins, a velvet-lined pocket beneath the display tray, activated only during specific mechanical conditions you controlled." Wiggins's shoulders slumped as though the air had been pulled from his lungs. I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. "It was a precaution. I built it years ago, long before the Sapphire even arrived." Holmes tilted his head, studying the man with cool detachment. "A precaution?" Wiggins nodded miserably. "For emergency. I told myself if something happened, if I was ever desperate, I'd have options." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. The detective's expression remained unreadable. Holmes carefully returned the metal plate to its drawer, closed the cabinet, and locked it again. "You'll remain at your workshop tonight," Holmes said. "Do not attempt to leave. Do not attempt to tamper with the vault at Penrose and Larchmere. Do you understand me?" Wiggins nodded without argument. Holmes turned on his heel, signaling for Watson to follow. Once they stepped back into the damp London air, Watson exhaled heavily. "So, it was Wiggins all along," he said. Holmes gave a small, tight smile. "That remains to be seen, Watson. The mechanics, but the motive and the timing, those questions remain unanswered." Watson frowned. "You think someone else was involved?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tucked his gloves into his coat pocket and said, almost to himself, "The true architect of this crime is still in the shadows." And with that, they walked back toward the main street, disappearing once more into the gathering fog. The next morning, Baker Street stirred earlier than usual. The fire had been lit before dawn, and Holmes had already finished his first cup of strong, black coffee by the time the first gray light filtered in through the curtains. Watson, seated at the breakfast table, watched as Holmes paced with controlled energy from window to fireplace and back again, glancing occasionally at the small glass vial resting on the mantel beside the sealed envelope containing Wiggins's hidden schematic. The previous day's discoveries weighed heavily in the air between them, but Holmes's focus seemed to have narrowed further still. At a little after 9 o'clock, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, holding a small calling card. "It's Miss Clarissa Penrose, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent but quiet." Holmes raised an eyebrow but showed no. "Show her in, please." Within moments, Clarissa appeared in the doorway. Her attire was less formal than before, a simple gray dress with a dark wool shawl draped around her shoulders. Her auburn hair, though neatly pinned, showed signs of haste in her morning preparation. More telling, however, was her expression, something between unease and determined resolve. Watson stood instinctively, motioning toward the chair nearest the fireplace. "Miss Penrose, please, sit." Clarissa settled herself, glancing first at Watson, then more directly at Holmes. "I hesitated to come, but after yesterday I thought it best." Holmes remained standing, his hands resting loosely in his coat pocket. "You were right to come." Clarissa took a slow breath. "It's about Mr. Wiggins." Watson exchanged a brief glance with Holmes, but said nothing. Clarissa continued, "I don't know if this is useful, but something's been troubling me for weeks, even before the Sapphire went missing." Holmes tilted his "Go on." "There were days when I stayed late to balance the books or prepare inventory reports for my uncle. On at least 2 occasions, I noticed Mr. Wiggins lingering long after his maintenance work should have been completed. Lingering? Holmes echoed. Clarissa nodded. At first I thought nothing of it. He's always been meticulous, sometimes overly so, but recently it became different. He would disappear for long stretches, not answering when I called from the front of the shop. And once, I found him near the vault after hours. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Doing what? Just standing there, as though listening or thinking. Watson leaned forward. Did he offer any explanation? Clarissa shook her head. He laughed it off, said he was double-checking the hinge mechanisms for tension drift. Holmes allowed a thin smile at the choice of technical jargon. A clever cover, he murmured. Clarissa's hands tightened in her lap. I started keeping notes, reaching into her small satchel and withdrawing a folded piece of paper. Holmes accepted it, unfolding the sheet carefully. Watson moved closer to glance over his shoulder. It was a handwritten log, dates, times, and brief observations. September 18th. Wiggins stayed past 6. Found near vault. October 2nd. Heard metallic sounds after closing. October 9th. Noticed faint smell of machine oil near vault room floorboards. Holmes read the notes, then folded the paper and slipped it into his inner coat pocket with deliberate care. You've been more observant than most, Miss Penrose. Clarissa met his gaze. I should have said something sooner. Holmes's voice softened. Better now. She hesitated, then added almost as an afterthought. And one more thing. Holmes nodded, encouraging her to continue. In the last few days before the disappearance, she said, Mr. Wiggins seemed distracted, preoccupied. I caught him staring at the vault door, not with focus, but something else. Regret, maybe, or fear. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but Watson noted the slight lift of his brows at final detail. Clarissa rose, smoothing her shawl. That's all I know, she said. But if there's anything else I can do, Holmes interrupted her gently. For now, Miss, keep your routine. Go about your day as though nothing has changed. If you notice anything new, anything at all, send word to me at once. Clarissa nodded, pausing at the door before turning back. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. After she left, Holmes stood near the window, watching as disappeared into the... Watson broke the silence. That was illuminating. Holmes's gaze remained distant. She's sharper than her uncle gives her credit for. Her instincts are good. Her timing, better. He moved toward his writing desk and opened a fresh page in his notebook. We're approaching the heart of this puzzle, Watson, Holmes said as he dipped his pen into the inkwell. And something tells me the clockmaker's alibi is growing thinner by the hour. Watson, sensing the inevitable next step, reached for his coat. Holmes didn't look up as he wrote, but his final words lingered in the room like smoke. Soon, Watson, very soon, the machinery behind this crime will reveal itself in full. And with that, the day's work resumed, quiet, steady, and closing steadily on the truth. Holmes wasted no time after Clarissa's departure. The moment the door closed behind her, he rose from his writing desk, retrieving from the mantel a small stack of hotel directories and railway timetables he had set aside earlier that morning. Watson, watching from his armchair, recognized the mood instantly. Holmes's investigative mind had entered that sharp, accelerated phase where details that once appeared loose and disconnected began to knot themselves into something approaching coherence. Holmes flipped quickly through the railway schedule for the London-Brighton line, his finger tracing down the list of departures and arrival. Watson, he said, pausing only briefly to glance over his shoulder, prepare yourself for a short excursion. Brighton awaits us. Watson set aside his book without hesitation. You intend to investigate Larchmere's alibi personally? Holmes nodded, already moving to retrieve his coat and gloves. I trust no detail of this case to chance, Watson. Larchmere was very deliberate when he mentioned the Royal Albion Hotel. Too deliberate. Within 20 minutes, the two men were seated in a first-class compartment aboard the southbound train, its steam engine hissing with restrained energy as it pulled out of Victoria Station. The journey to Brighton passed quickly, the landscape rushing past the window, wet fields, blurred hedgerows, and scattered villages cloaked in fog. Holmes said little, though Watson noticed the detective's gaze resting on scenery, his mind clearly far from the Sussex countryside. Upon arrival, they made their way through the damp streets of Brighton toward the Royal Albion Hotel, a grand cream-colored building facing the sea. The salty air mixed with the smell of wet stone and distant coal smoke from the nearby docks. Inside the hotel lobby, Holmes approached the front desk with the calm confidence of a man unaccustomed to refusal. "Good afternoon," he said, removing his gloves with slow precision. "I am Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I should like to speak with the hotel manager regarding Mr. Edwin Larchmere's stay here last week." The young receptionist, startled at first, quickly disappeared into a back office. Moments later, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a neatly trimmed mustache appeared. His name, according to the brass badge pinned to his waistcoat, was Mr. Redgrave, manager. Holmes introduced himself formally, presenting a card for verification. After a brief explanation of their inquiry, framed as a simple verification of dates for business purposes, Mr. Redgrave obligingly produced the hotel register. "Mr. Larchmere checked in on the evening of the 12th, Redgrave confirmed, running a finger down. "Stayed through the 14th. Room 16, sea-facing." Holmes leaned over the book, examining the signature. There it was, bold, confident, unmistakably in Larchmere's own hand. "Did he dine here in the hotel during his stay?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Redgrave replied. "Breakfast both mornings in the main dining room. We also have a receipt for laundry services." Holmes nodded. "And were there any visitors to Mr. Larchmere during that time?" Redgrave frowned slightly, thinking back. "Not that I recall. He seemed to prefer solitude. Took most of his meals alone. Spent afternoons walking along the promenade. Kept to himself." Holmes pressed a little further. "Staff interactions? Any remarks from the maids, porters, or dining room attendants?" Redgrave shook it. "None of significance. A quiet gentleman, paid in full upon departure." Holmes gave a final glance over the register and then offered a polite smile. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Redgrave. You've been most helpful." As they left the hotel, Watson adjusted his hat against the light drizzle that had begun again. "Well?" he asked as they strolled toward the railway station. Holmes walked in silence for his eyes scanning the street with absent interest. "His alibi holds, confirmed by independent witnesses, multiple signatures, and third-party receipts, at least on paper," and furrowed his. "But you sound unconvinced." Holmes gave a faint smile. "I rarely accept any alibi without testing its elasticity." On the return journey, Holmes pulled from his coat pocket a small map of Southwark and a second sheet of paper upon which he had drawn a timeline of the crime. Watson watched as Holmes's pencil darted across the page, drawing lines, arrows, and notations, calculating distances, weighing time frames, reconstructing the window in which the Sapphire could have disappeared. Back at Baker Street later that afternoon, Holmes placed the Brighton Hotel receipts atop the growing stack of evidence on his desk. "Larchmere's movements during the critical days are accounted for," Holmes said aloud, more for his own benefit than Watson's. "But his absence from Southwark may yet prove more interesting than his presence would have been." Watson, "Meaning?" Holmes turned, low smile for. "Sometimes, Watson, the perfect alibi is not the shield of innocence, but the first layer of misdirection." With that, Holmes settled back into his chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and closed his eyes, inviting silence to fill the room once again, as his mind worked relentlessly on the puzzle that was slowly, but undeniably, beginning to unravel. The late afternoon light over London hung low and golden, filtering through the thick autumn haze that had settled along Baker. The air held that unmistakable chill of October with a dampness that made its way through even the thickest. Holmes sat at his desk, the clutter of recent days now neatly arranged, the Brighton hotel receipts, Clarissa's handwritten notes, the sliver of sapphire sealed safely in its vial, and most critically, the detailed Swiss schematics of the vault, which Penrose had delivered earlier that morning as requested. For nearly an hour, Holmes had studied the diagrams in near total silence. His eyes moved slowly across the engineering drawings, following the layers of steel, the tension points, the gear ratios, and the safety interlocks designed to prevent unauthorized access. Watson, seated nearby, a cup of tea gone cold in his hand, watched with growing anticipation. He recognized the signs, the subtle narrowing of the barely perceptible tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped unconsciously at the edge of the... At last, Holmes sat back, with a slow, deliberate breath. "It's there." More to himself, Watson leaned forward. "What is?" Holmes lifted the schematic, holding it at an angle to a discrepancy, barely noticeable, but present. He pointed to a section near the lower quadrant of the vault interior, the space directly beneath the gem display tray. According to this, Holmes explained, there should be no hollow cavity beneath the tray's base plate. The steel support frame is continuous, uninterrupted. Watson's eyes followed Holmes's fingertip across the page. "But based on what we found in Wiggins's workshop," Holmes continued, "there is a hidden compartment, one that doesn't exist on the manufacturer's original design." Watson set his cup aside. "Meaning? Wiggins modified the vault after installation?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Exactly, quietly, carefully, over time." Holmes rose from his chair, reaching for his overcoat and cane with the sudden, focused energy of a man whose patience had finally reached its useful limit. "Come, Watson, we're going back to Southwark." By the time they arrived at Penrose and Larchmere, the gas lamps along the street had flickered to life. The shop had closed for the evening, but Penrose himself remained inside, waiting anxiously near the front door. Holmes barely paused for pleasantry. "We need access to the vault, immediately." Penrose, startled but obedient, retrieved the combination code and led them to the rear. Inside the vault room, the atmosphere felt different tonight. The air was colder, and the small overhead lamp cast long, angular shadows across the steel surfaces. Holmes moved directly to the display alcove, kneeling at its base with a practiced swiftness. From his coat pocket, he produced two slender instruments, a narrow steel wedge, and a tension gauge, both tools designed for delicate manipulation. Watson watched as Holmes slid the wedge carefully along the seam they had observed days earlier, the near-invisible line that traced horizontally across the back panel of. Penrose stood to the side, wringing his hands, his face pale and drawn. With careful incremental pressure, Holmes adjusted the tension gauge until a soft metallic click sounded from within the wall. Penrose gasped audibly, stepping forward. Holmes held up a steady hand. "Wait." Watson stepped closer as Holmes pressed against the panel. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the false base shifted forward by half an inch. Holmes inserted the steel wedge once more and applied a slight upward lift. With a muted sigh, the entire section of the back wall tipped forward, revealing a narrow, velvet-lined pocket built seamlessly into the steel framework. And there, nestled deep inside, lay the royal sapphire of Kashmir. Its deep blue surface shimmered even in the low light, catching the gold glow of the gas lamp as though mocking the darkness in which it had been hidden. For several long seconds, no one in the room spoke. Penrose brought a shaking hand to his mouth, as though to suppress both relief and horror. Watson, recovering first, exhaled a low whistle. Incredible! Holmes, however, remained utterly composed. With a gloved hand, he lifted the gem and placed it carefully onto a small silk cloth he had brought with him, folding it with precision and tucking it safely away. He rose slowly to his feet, turning toward Penrose. "As I suspected," Holmes said, his voice low and even, "the sapphire never left this room." Penrose blinked, struggling for words. "But how? How long?" Holmes gestured toward the exposed compartment. "Years, most likely." The mechanism was installed well before the gem's arrival, waiting for the right moment and the right prize. Penrose sank into the nearest chair, his face pale. Holmes stepped back, carefully resetting the false panel with a soft click, concealing the pocket once more. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Wiggins again," Holmes said, turning toward the door. "But first, I want time to think." As they left the vault room, Watson cast one last glance at the sealed compartment, now hidden once more behind steel and velvet. Outside, the London fog had thickened. The air tasted of smoke and rain. Holmes paused at the shop's front entrance, looking out into the night with the measured calm of a man whose puzzle had finally begun to yield it. The stone was never gone, only misplaced by design. And with that, they stepped out into the cold, the case now turning toward its inevitable Holmes said little during the return to Baker Street. The wrapped sapphire rested securely in his coat pocket, but the weight of the stone seemed light compared to the questions that still lingered. Watson could sense it in his friend's movements, the way Holmes's eyes shifted with restless calculation, the way his fingers drummed against the inside of his coat as though tracing invisible patterns. The following morning arrived gray and sluggish, with a low ceiling of cloud that threatened more rain, but never fully delivered. Inside the sitting room at 2.1b, the fire burned low, casting soft, uneven light against the worn wallpaper and familiar shelves lined with monographs and case files. Holmes stood at the window, looking out at the slow procession of handsome umbrellaed pedestrians. Watson sat nearby, nursing his cup of tea, eyeing the small silk-wrapped bundle resting atop Holmes' desk with cautious. At 10:30, the sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock followed almost immediately. "Mr. Penrose for you, sir," she announced. "Show him in," Holmes replied without turning from the window. Penrose entered with hurried steps, his expression a mixture of exhaustion, anxiety, and anticipation. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his gloves bore the subtle creases of a man who had spent the night twisting them nervously. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathless, "you sent word that I should come. Is there news?" Holmes remained still for a long moment, barely turning. He crossed the room without haste, moving to the desk and lifting the silk wrap. Wordlessly, he unwrapped it. There, resting in the center of the cloth, lay the royal sapphire of Kashmir. The deep velvety blue of the stone caught the late morning light, refracting it in soft, dazzling ribbons across the room. Penrose froze where he... For several seconds he simply stared at the gem, as though doubting it. "You?" Watson, standing nearby, watched as Penrose approached the desk, leaning closer but stopping short of touching the stone, as though afraid that physical contact might break the spell. Holmes's tone remained measured and controlled. "The sapphire never left your premises, Mr. Penrose. It was hidden, cleverly, and with deliberate forethought, within a concealed compartment in the vault itself." Penrose looked up sharply. "In the vault?" Holmes nodded. "Beneath the display alcove, behind a false panel, accessible only through a carefully engineered trigger within the vault's own mechanism, a design I have every reason to believe was created by Mr. Wiggins." Penrose's face paled further. "Wiggins? But how?" Holmes folded the cloth back over the stone. "With skill, patience, and a profound understanding of mechanical design, the compartment was likely built years ago, long before the sapphire ever arrived, waiting for a time when it might prove useful." Watson stepped in then, his tone gentler. "Your trust in Wiggins, while understandable, was not well placed." Penrose sank slowly into the nearest chair, his shoulders slumping as the reality settled over him. "I can hardly believe it." Holmes remained standing, his gaze cool but not unkind. "I intend to speak with Mr. Wiggins again today, at length." Penrose's eyes widened with dread. "You don't believe he intended to?" Holmes raised a hand to forestall the question. "That is what I mean to determine. His involvement in the engineering of the hidden compartment is beyond doubt. His intentions, that remains to be seen." For several moments the room lapsed into silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of London stirring beyond the window glass. Finally, Penrose stood, smoothing the front of his coat with trembling hands. "What happens next?" he asked quietly. Holmes replaced the silk-wrapped sapphire into his desk drawer, locking it with deliberate care. "For now, Mr. Penrose, nothing will leave this room," Holmes said. "The public need not know. Scotland Yard will remain uninformed, at least until I decide otherwise. But you may take some comfort in this. The stone is safe. The vault is restored. And soon the full story will reveal itself." Penrose nodded numbly, moving toward the door as if in a dream. Watson waited until the door closed behind him before speaking. "You're holding back something, Holmes," he said softly. Holmes turned, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Of course I am. The recovery of the sapphire. That was just the lock. The real key is motive." He crossed to the window, gazing out at the city once more. "And as we both know, mechanical skill builds the trap, but human need springs it." Watson said nothing more, But as he watched Holmes stand there in the soft light of late morning, he felt the unmistakable shift, the sense that the case, though technically solved in part, had not yet reached its true conclusion. And Holmes was already. The air in Baker Street grew heavier, afternoon deepened. Clouds pressed low against the London skyline, and a fine drizzle began to streak the window panes once more, as though the weather itself mirrored the mood inside 221B. Holmes remained at his desk, the sealed drawer containing the recovered sapphire untouched since morning. On the table beside him rested the folded schematic from Wiggins' workshop, Clarissa's handwritten observations, and Holmes's own notes, lines of deduction and probability that sprawled across 3 pages of thin foolscap paper. Watson, seated across the room, watched Holmes with a quiet unease. He had witnessed many interrogations, many confessions over the years, but there was something different about this one. Holmes wasn't merely preparing to confront a criminal. He was preparing to extract the truth from a man teetering on the edge of. At precisely 3 o'clock, a soft, reluctant knock echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Hudson opened the door just enough to lean inside. "Mr. Wiggins is here, Mr. Holmes. Shall I show him up?" Holmes, "Yes, and thank you, Mrs. Hudson." A few moments later, Wiggins appeared at the threshold. If he had looked tired before, today he looked broken. His complexion had taken on a sickly gray tone. The tremor in his left hand, subtle before, now made his fingers twitch uncontrollably against the brim of his hat. His eyes, dull and rimmed with sleeplessness, shifted constantly, never resting in one place for long. Watson noted the deep lines along the sides of his creases carved by weeks, perhaps months, of worry. Holmes gestured to the chair nearest the. "Please, Mr. Wiggins, sit." Wiggins obeyed without protest, settling into the chair like a man without strength. Holmes remained standing, taking slow, deliberate steps across the room before turning to face. "I trust you understand why I've asked you here today." Wiggins swallowed hard. Holmes nodded toward the sealed drawer. "We recovered the sapphire this morning from inside the vault, hidden in a compartment you designed." Wiggins said nothing, but Watson saw his shoulders sag as though a physical weight had been added. Holmes continued, his tone low but even. "I've reviewed your schematics. I've examined the tools in your workshop. I've seen the timing mechanisms, the release plates, the spring-loaded chamber you engineered." A long silence followed. Finally, Wiggins's voice broke through the quiet, thin, trembling, almost inaudible. I didn't want to do it." Holmes said nothing, letting the words come as they would. "I built the compartment years ago," continued, staring at the floor. "It was just an experiment, a technical challenge. I told myself it was harmless, just a curiosity. I never planned to use it." Watson exchanged a quick glance with Holmes, but remained silent. But then Wiggins' voice cracked. "The debts started piling up, repairs for the workshop, rent behind, suppliers threatening to cut me off, and then came the sapphire." Holmes's voice remained soft but firm. "Tell me, when did you decide?" Wiggins covered his face with both hands. "I don't know. Maybe the day I finished the last maintenance on the vault. I stood there looking at that stone, and I knew. I had the means. The mechanism was already there. Waiting." Watson's heart sank at the confession. There was no triumph in this moment, only the slow, inevitable crumbling of a man who had built his own ruin with the same hands that once built delicate timepieces. "I timed it for after hours," Wiggins continued, lowering his hands, "late at night when the shop was empty. I came back with a key, a skeleton key I'd fashioned for maintenance access door. I triggered the mechanism, let the sapphire drop behind the false panel. Then I reset everything. Nothing had happened." Holmes's expression softened, only slightly, but there was no triumph in his voice, only understanding of human frailty. "And after that?" Holmes asked. Wiggins's gaze dropped again. "I didn't know what to do next. I thought maybe wait a week, then come back for it. But then Penrose discovered the gem missing the next morning. And after that, you were involved." Watson folded his arms across, watching. "You panicked." Wiggins nodded miserably. "Every day since, I've been waiting, terrified, listening for every knock on the door, every voice in the hallway. I knew it was only a matter of time. The room remained silent except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Holmes stepped forward and placed a hand, not harsh but steady, on Wiggins's shoulder. "You engineered the trap, but you never had the will for the theft." Wiggins squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping down one worn cheek. Holmes stood, moving toward his desk. He opened a drawer and retrieved a fresh sheet of paper. "I won't call the Yard." "Not yet," Holmes said without looking up. "But you will sit here, in this room, and write out every detail, every step you took, from the first design to the last adjustment." Wiggins nodded slowly, accepting the pen Holmes placed before him. As the clock continued its steady ticking, the old clockmaker began to write, his hand still trembling, but moving all the same. And as he did, Holmes stood at the window once more, gazing out at the fog-laden city below, already considering what mercy and justice should look like for a man like Mr. Wiggins. Holmes stood by the window for several long minutes after Wiggins had finished writing. The old clockmaker sat slumped in the chair near the fireplace, the completed confession resting on the small table beside him, ink still. His shoulders had sagged under the invisible weight of guilt and exhaustion, and he now stared vacantly at the floor, his hands limp in his lap. Watson remained seated nearby, silent but watchful, his expression a mixture of pity and professional detachment. The confession, written in Wiggins's shaky but unmistakable hand, laid bare every step of the deception, the secret modifications, the hidden compartment, the timing of the theft, and the spiral of fear that followed. Holmes turned at last and crossed the room to his desk. He picked up the confession, folded it neatly, and placed it inside a small envelope before locking it in the drawer that now also held the recovered sapphire. Wiggins stirred slightly at the sound of the drawer. "Mr. Holmes," barely more. "What happens now?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to his chair, settling into it with slow deliberation. He rested his elbows on the armrests and steepled his fingers beneath. "There are two paths before us, slow but clear. The first, as you imagine, would involve Scotland Yard, an arrest, formal charges, a trial, your name, printed in every paper in London by the end of the week." Wiggins closed his eyes, bracing for a physical blow. Holmes paused, letting the weight of that future settle into the room before he continued. "The second path," Holmes said slowly, "depends entirely on the goodwill of Mr. Penrose, and perhaps on my own professional judgment." Watson blinked at that, casting a curious glance at Holmes. This was not the tone he had expected. Holmes continued, his gaze still fixed on Wiggins. "You have confessed fully. You have returned, or at least enabled the recovery of the stolen property. And I believe you when you say that, but of a desperate man making an unforgivable mistake." Wiggins opened his eyes, something like faint hope flickering behind the Watson. "Holmes, are you truly considering—" "I am, but only after I've spoken with Mr. Penrose." Holmes rose, collecting his. He turned back to Wiggins, who still hadn't. "You will remain here," Holmes said firmly. "For now. Watson will stay with you. Consider this, a pause in the clock's movement, not freedom, not yet." Wiggins gave a weary nod. "Yes, Mr. Holmes." With that, Holmes left the room, descending the stairs two at a time. By the time Holmes arrived at Penrose and Larchmere that afternoon, the rain had returned, light but persistent. Penrose greeted him in the rear office, still pale from the shock of recent days. Holmes wasted no time in presenting the facts. He described the mechanism, the confession, the years-long existence of the secret compartment, Wiggins's mounting debts, the night of the crime, the old clockmaker's emotional collapse under pressure. Throughout the explanation, Penrose sat in silence, staring into the middle distance, hands clasped tightly together. When Holmes finished, Penrose let out a long, controlled breath. "So, it was him all along," he said quietly. Holmes nodded. Penrose rose from his chair, walking slowly toward the window that overlooked the rain-slicked street. Holmes gave him time. Minutes passed. Finally, Penrose turned back, his face grim but resolute. "I won't prosecute." Holmes blinked, though the decision didn't truly surprise him. Penrose continued, his voice steady, but with an underlying sadness. "What good would it do? The sapphire is recovered. The damage, while real, can still be contained." If word of this theft became public, it would destroy not only Wiggins, but my business, my family name, my client's trust. Holmes nodded slowly, understanding the full calculation. I'll pay off his debts, Penrose said, as though making a final decision aloud. Quietly, I'll ensure he has a fresh start, somewhere far from London. Holmes raised. Mercy, Mr. Penrose? That's unexpected. Penrose's expression softened. He's been with me nearly 15 years. This was a moment of weakness, not malice. Holmes picked up his hat and cane, giving a final nod of approval. A wise decision. Later that evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes informed Wiggins of Penn's choice. The old clockmaker broke down, not with loud sobs, with silent, shaking gratitude that left him unable. Holmes said nothing as Wiggins stood to leave, but as the man reached the door, Holmes offered one last quiet piece of advice. Find a village, Mr. Wiggins, he said softly. Somewhere small, somewhere with clocks that need fixing, but no vaults. Wiggins nodded, unable to speak, disappeared down the... As the door clicked shut, Watson turned toward Holmes. Mercy indeed, he said. Holmes, standing by the window, offered a faint smile. Sometimes, Watson, justice doesn't require the sound of a gavel. He poured himself a small measure of brandy and settled into his chair staring into the flames as the rain outside continued, steady and slow. That evening, as darkness settled fully over London, 221B Baker Street felt quieter than usual. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the flicker of the gas lamps outside lent a subdued glow to the sitting room's window pane. The air inside carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, old books, and the faint remnants of tobacco from Holmes's earlier pipe. Holmes sat in his chair by the fireplace, one long leg crossed over the other, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. His violin rested untouched on the nearby table, and his pipe remained cold in its stand. He had spent the better part of the last hour in contemplative silence, breaking it only occasionally to sip from the small glass of brandy he cradled loosely in one hand. Watson, seated opposite, observed his friend with a practiced eye. The doctor recognized this stillness, not one of exhaustion or defeat, but of rare reflection. Holmes had solved the case, restored the missing jewel, and prevented scandal, yet still, something lingered beneath the surface. Watson set down the evening paper and cleared his throat gently. You're unusually quiet tonight, Holmes. Holmes blinked slowly, as though emerging from some private reverie. Am I? He said. Though the question sounded rhetorical, Watson smiled faintly. You are, which, as history has shown, generally signals the onset of one of your philosophical moods. Holmes allowed himself the smallest of smiles, but said nothing immediately. He stared into the fire a while longer before finally speaking, his voice low and thoughtful. It's curious, Watson, he began, how certain cases linger with a man more than others. There are crimes that end with a dramatic flourish, a chase, a courtroom, a confession shouted in desperation. Those cases are satisfying in a theatrical sense, but this one... He paused, swirling the last of the brandy in his glass. This one feels different. Watson nodded, understanding. Because the criminal wasn't a villain, not truly. Holmes tilted his head in agreement. Indeed, Wiggins didn't act out of greed or spite or ambition. He acted out of quiet, slow, corrosive desperation. Years of it, perhaps. The pressure building in small increments until he reached a point where he could no longer see a way out. Watson leaned back in his chair. And in the end, he confessed. Not because you forced him, but because he could no longer carry the weight of it. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the fire. There's something deeply human and deeply tragic in that. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the half-hour. After a long pause, Holmes shifted his attention, reaching for the small wooden box where he kept his pipe tobacco. He opened it, then paused mid-motion, seeming to reconsider. Instead, he closed the box and set it aside. You know, Watson, he said after him, in cases like these, the real mystery isn't in the crime, but in the decision, the precise moment when an otherwise honest man crosses an invisible line and steps willingly into the shadow. Watson regarded his with quiet respect. And you believe that moment is always a choice? Holmes's expression softened, though his eyes remained distant. Always, though rarely, a simple one. A few minutes passed in silence. Watson returned to his paper. Holmes remained still, listening to the quiet crackle of the soft rustle of pages turning, the muffled sounds of London life beyond their window. Outside, the mist thickened, curling in soft tendrils around the lamppost, blurring the outlines of passing carriages and pedestrians moving through the... Inside, the room remained warm and still, with both men content, for now, to let the case of the Southwark Sapphire settle gently, another case closed, another chapter written, and the slow, steady rhythm of London life continued. By the time midnight approached, London had sunk fully into that rare kind of silence only found on rain-soaked nights. The streets below Baker Street glistened under the steady glow of gas lamps, each puddle reflecting soft ribbons of light, forgotten mirrors. Holmes remained seated by the window, gazing out into the fog-laden city with an expression unreadable to anyone but Watson, who had long since learned how to interpret the subtleties of his friend's quiet moods. Watson had put aside his medical journals for the evening. The fire burned low, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the room. The smell of damp wool and tobacco hung in the air, though Holmes's pipe remained untouched on the corner table. A low knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered quietly, holding a small tray. On it sat a fresh pot of tea and a covered dish. Watson had requested something light. Knowing Holmes would likely refuse anything heavier, Holmes turned slightly as she entered, offering her a brief nod of thanks. "Rain set in again, sir," casting a glance toward the window. "Looks like it'll keep through the night." Holmes gave, "London breathes in fog and exhales rain, Mrs. Hudson. It's part of the rhythm." She smiled warmly and withdrew, leaving the two men once again alone. Watson poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Holmes. For a time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the gentle tap of rain against the window glass and the faint crackle of cooling embers in the hearth. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low, almost contemplative. "Watson, there's something oddly fitting about the timing of this case." Watson glanced up from his tea. "How so?" Holmes set his cup aside, standing and walking slowly to the fireplace. He leaned one hand against the mantel, staring into the coals. "Consider it the rain, the fog, the closed circle of suspects, the elegant simplicity of the crime's execution, hidden beneath layers of mechanical complexity." Watson nodded thoughtfully. "It did unfold with a certain symmetry." Holmes's smile deepened, though it carried no trace of humor. "Yes, symmetry. A locked vault, a missing jewel, a loyal niece, a distant business partner, an aging clockmaker, and desperation wrapped in precision engineering." He turned toward Watson. "We often think of crime as loud, violent, impulsive, but this was quiet, deliberate almost." Watson set his cup down and folded his... "Do you regret letting Wiggins go free?" Holmes shook his head. "No. He'll suffer more from his own conscience than any prison sentence could provide." Watson studied his friend's face, seeing the subtle weariness there, the emotional residue left behind after every case that demanded not only intellect but human judgment. Holmes crossed to the window again, peering out at the wet streets below. The last of the evening carriages rolled by, their wheels cutting soft arcs through the standing water. London itself seemed at rest, breathing slowly beneath the mist. Holmes spoke again, almost as if to himself. "Some crimes, Watson, are born from quiet despair, not malice, and tonight I feel no satisfaction in their solving, only resolution." Watson let the words hang in the air, not replying. The two men sat in companionable silence for the rest of the hour. No case notes were written that night. No violin strings were touched. No further deductions chased loose ends. There was only the fire, the steady rain, and the soft ticking of the mantel clock, marking the slow, inevitable passage toward morning. The days that followed unfolded with an unfamiliar stillness inside 221B Baker. The usual interruptions, urgent telegrams, anxious clients, or sudden late-night calls to the countryside, seemed to pause as though London itself had agreed to give Holmes a brief and well-earned respite. For the first time in weeks, there was no case file resting on the corner of Holmes's desk, no maps pinned to the walls with pins and string, no half-drained chemical beakers cluttering the side tables. Holmes settled back into his quieter routines with a sort of subdued rhythm. Each morning he rose early, dressing with careful attention, though more out of habit than necessity. The Times arrived promptly at 7, and Holmes read it from cover to cover at the breakfast table, marking occasional paragraphs with a soft pencil when something caught his attention. Though none of those notes, Watson noticed, turned into cases. By mid-morning, Holmes often retreated to the sitting room, where he occupied himself with small experiments of no particular urgency, testing chemical reactions on paper samples, or recalibrating a delicate balance scale whose sensitivity he had been adjusting for months. The violin reappeared by the third day. Holmes didn't play loudly or with great flourish, but rather with slow, thoughtful strokes, soft melodies that drifted like mist through the flat, weaving between the ticking of the mantel clock and the low crackle of the fireplace. Watson, relieved by the change of atmosphere, resumed his own routines as well. He attended to his private practice in the mornings, seeing patients in Marylebone and Paddington, then returned by early afternoon to find Holmes seated near the window, reading a scientific journal or thumbing through old case notes with idle curiosity. There were moments of conversation between them, but they were gentle and unhurried. One afternoon, Watson asked, "You're sure you're not restless, Holmes?" Holmes glanced up from his reading, offering a faint, tired smile. "Restless, Watson? No, not this week. The city is quiet. My mind, for once, is quiet." Watson understood. On the fourth evening, Holmes took a long walk through Regent's Park alone, returning just after sunset with damp shoulders and a faint smell of wet leaves clinging to his coat. He hung the coat carefully near the hearth and sat for nearly an hour staring into the fire without speaking. Mrs. Hudson, sensing the mood of the flat, moved more quietly than usual in the hallway. She served their meals with a kind of motherly watchfulness, bringing extra blankets for the chairs and refilling the coal scuttle before either man had to ask. By the end of the week, the world outside began to stir again. A telegram arrived from Scotland Yard. Nothing urgent, just a request for Holmes's opinion on a property dispute involving forged signatures. Holmes replied politely, but declined to involve himself. Watson noticed the soft return of color to Holmes's face, the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease, the sharp edge of post-investigation fatigue slowly dulling. Late on the seventh night, as Watson prepared to retire to his bedroom, he paused in the doorway of the sitting room and glanced back. Holmes sat in his chair by the fire, a book open on his lap, the violin resting nearby. His gaze wasn't focused on the pages, but on the slow, steady movement. The room was filled with the quiet sounds of London at rest, distant carriage wheels, the faint cry of a newspaper boy on the corner, and the patient ticking of the clock that kept perfect time on them. And for the first time in many months, there was no mystery waiting in the shadows, only peace, for now. It was late morning on the 8th day when Mrs. Hudson entered the sitting room with a small cream-colored envelope resting delicately atop her silver tray. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes," setting the tray on the corner of his desk with her usual care. Holmes, seated by the window with a small book on mineral compositions balanced on his knee, glanced at the envelope without immediate interest, but something in the handwriting, elegant, flowing, unmistakably feminine, caught his attention. He set the book aside, took the envelope in hand, and studied the return address. Southwark. Watson, looking up from his morning newspaper, raised an eyebrow. "From Penrose?" Holmes shook his head faintly. "No, this is Miss Clarissa Penrose's handwriting." Without further delay, he opened the envelope with a small ivory-handled letter opener. Inside, there was no lengthy correspondence, only a single sheet of stationery, upon which Clarissa had written a short but carefully chosen message. "Mr. Holmes, I wished only to extend my gratitude, not just for the return of the Sapphire, but for your kindness in how the matter was handled. Some truths are better left quietly behind us. With thanks, Clarissa Penrose." Holmes read the letter twice slowly, as though weighing every word. Enclosed with the note, carefully pressed between the folds of the paper, was a small dried flower, a sprig of lavender, its color faded but still delicate, its fragrance faint but unmistakable. For a moment Holmes remained perfectly still, holding the flower between his fingers. Watson, watching from his seat, tilted his head, a token of gratitude. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he stood, crossing to the far bookshelf near. With deliberate care, he opened a worn volume of Goethe's poems, an edition Watson had on the shelf for years, but rarely in his hands. Without comment, Holmes placed the dried lavender inside the book, closing it softly, and waited, curious but unwilling to press. After a pause, Holmes returned to his, as though nothing had happened, but Watson noted with quiet sadness that Holmes turned no pages for the next 20 minutes. He simply sat there, staring into the middle distance. A faint, almost imperceptible smile. Outside, the rain had eased for the first time in days. The clouds hung thinner, and a rare patch of pale blue sky appeared above Baker Street, just visible through the soot-streaked glass. Life moved on, and somewhere, not far across London, a young woman with auburn hair and sharp instincts was likely sitting in her own quiet room, glad, perhaps more than she would ever admit, that Sherlock Holmes had been the man to handle her family's most delicate of scandals. Watson returned to his paper, letting the moment settle between them. The lavender remained in it, unseen, not forgotten. The gray skies over London had brightened some by the following week, though the air still carried the crisp of late October. Holmes remained in his usual chair by the fireplace, the morning paper folded on the side table, untouched. His gaze drifted occasionally to the mantel clock, but his mind, Watson could tell, was somewhere far beyond Baker Street. Watson sat at his writing desk, updating patient records from his practice, though more than once his attention wandered to Holmes's distant expression. It had been days since the Southwark affair had concluded, yet Holmes had remained curiously quiet, his energies turned inward. The case had been solved, yes, the sapphire recovered, the confession written, but something about it lingered like an unfinished note in Holmes's mind. Watson was halfway through drafting a referral letter for a patient when Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up from the landing. "Mr. Holmes, there's a letter for you. Looks official. Posted from Sussex." Holmes didn't stir at first, but after a few moments he rose with a deliberate grace, reluctantly surfacing from deep thought. He crossed the room, accepting the envelope from Mrs. Hudd, a small nod. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and bore the unmistakable imprint of rural postage. The ink, though carefully applied, showed the slight bleeding of letters often seen with countryside fountain pens used in damp weather. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Holmes returned to his chair and slit the envelope open with his letter knife. He unfolded the paper inside and began to read. Watson set down his pen and watched his friend closely, noting the subtle change in Holmes's expression as he progressed through the letter. His eyes narrowed slightly at first, then relaxed, his mouth settling into something like approval. After a minute, Holmes refolded the letter and laid it neatly on the table beside his teacup. "Well?" Watson prompted, unable to suppress his curiosity. Holmes looked up, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "It's from the parish warden of a small village along the Sussex coast, near Rye." Watson waited, knowing Holmes would elaborate when he chose. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "It seems that Mr. Wiggins has settled there, under his own arrangement and at Mr. Penrose's discreet suggestion, a modest cottage near the village square." Watson, "Already? That was fast." Penrose didn't waste time in facilitating the quiet relocation, a small stipend, and, most importantly, no questions asked. Watson leaned back in his chair. "And Wiggins? How is he adapting?" Holmes reached for the letter again, scanning a particular passage. "He has taken responsibility for the maintenance and repair of the village chapel clock." Holmes, "The villagers, though wary at first, have found him to be punctual and skilled. He speaks little. His work is precise." Watson smiled faintly. "A fitting occupation, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of open reflection. Indeed, he's returned to the one thing he never betrayed, the discipline of timekeeping. Watson stood and crossed to the sideboard, pouring himself a small glass. I imagine the quiet of the countryside will do him good. Less temptation, fewer vaults to modify. Holmes gave a soft chuckle, low, brief, but genuine. Quite. Watson sipped his drink, then asked, "And Penrose? Any word from him?" Holmes nodded. "A short note this morning. He informs me that business at the shop has resumed as normal. No questions from clients, no leaks to the press. Larchmere has returned from Brighton and, according to Penrose, remains professionally distant." Watson frowned thoughtfully. "Do you believe Larchmere ever suspected Wiggins, or that he had any involvement at all?" Holmes shrugged lightly. Larchmere's alibi was solid. His temperament, less so. But guilt by personality is no substitute for evidence. Whatever his private opinions, he was content to let the matter close. Watson walked to the window, gazing out at the bustle of Baker Street. "It's strange, Holmes. This case, it resolved quietly. No arrests, no headlines, just a gradual return to normal life for everyone involved." Holmes stood and joined him by the window. Together they watched as a young boy ran, while a flower vendor arranged late autumn chrysanthemums in a small cart at the. Holmes spoke, almost as if thinking aloud. "That's the nature of certain crimes, Watt. They end not with noise, but with stillness." The two men remained there for some time, listening to the life of the city below, letting the quiet news from the countryside settle into the rhythm of their day. Eventually, Holmes stepped back, moving toward his violin. Without a word, he lifted it to his shoulder and began to play, a slow, wandering melody that filled the room with soft, reflective notes. Watson returned to his writing, but the smile on his face lingered longer than usual. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds began to thin, and for the first time in many days, a pale shaft of sunlight broke through, illuminating the corner of Holmes's desk where the letter from Sussex now read undisturbed. The days that followed drifted by with a soft, almost meditative rhythm at Baker Street. The lingering dampness of October began to lift as early November arrived, bringing with it colder winds and a sharper clarity to the air. The streets of London bustled with their usual chaos, vendors calling out prices, newspaper boys shouting the latest headlines, but inside 221B there was a noticeable calm. Holmes had resumed his quieter habits. There were no new cases, no telegrams marked urgent stacked on the desk, no restless pacing late at night. Watson noticed that Holmes spent more time with his books, revisiting scientific journals and obscure volumes on mechanical design, perhaps still mentally revisiting the intricacies of the Penrose vault. One late afternoon, as the golden light of a low winter sun slanted across the room, Holmes sat by the window with his violin in hand but made no move to play. Instead, he simply stared at the instrument, fingers resting along the strings, lost in thought. Watson, seated with a book nearby, finally spoke. "You've been unusually reflective these past days." Holmes's gaze remained on the violin. "Some cases leave echoes, Watson." Watson set his book aside. "The Southwark case?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, but not for the reasons one might expect." Watson waited, sensing something more substantial was coming. Holmes lowered the violin to his lap and laced his fingers together, staring into the corner of the room as though replaying recent events in his mind. "You see, Watson, over the years, I've observed patterns, motives shaped by greed, jealousy, revenge, but occasionally you encounter something far less theatrical. A crime born not from malice, but slow erosion, the gradual wearing down of a man's dignity, the kind of pressure that doesn't explode, but leaks. One small decision at Wiggins. Here was a man who spent his life perfecting the art of small, invisible corrections, someone who, with time, kept others punctual, kept the world running on silent, reliable intervals. He stood, moving toward the mantel where the confession still rested, now folded and tied with a simple length of. Holmes picked it up, turning it over in his hands. And yet, when it mattered most, his own internal clock failed him. Watson approached, watching as Holmes replaced the confession inside a small wooden box and locked it away. After a pause, Holmes spoke again, his voice quieter. "There's something to be learned here, Watson. A lesson not about crime, but about people. Watson smiled. You're not often one for moral reflections. Tilted his head. Perhaps not. But in this case, I found it difficult to ignore. He returned to his chair and leaned back, staring at the ceiling with the tired but peaceful expression of a man who had finally allowed himself to exhale. After weeks of mental strain, Watson sat down as well, the two men falling into one of their familiar silences. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the faint chime of a nearby church bell marked the hour. Finally, Holmes broke the quiet with, "There is dignity in repairing what one has broken quietly, without a..." Watson looked over at his friend, recognizing the rare vulnerability in the statement. He said nothing, choosing instead to let the room settle back into stillness. For that evening at least, there were no puzzles to solve, no crimes to dissect. Only two men, the fire, and the slow, steady tick of the clock marking another day's quiet lessons. By the second week of November, the air in London had grown colder, and the nights arrived earlier with each passing day. The city streets were alive with the early preparations for the coming winter season. Merchants stacking crates of coal, shopkeepers adjusting their window displays to showcase heavier fabrics and thicker overcoats, and the first whispers of holiday orders began drifting among the jewelers and merchants. At Penrose and Larchmere Jewelers, however, the mood remained carefully subdued. Holmes and Watson arrived just after dusk at Penrose's invitation. The letter had been to the point. "Mr. Holmes, I would like to mark the quiet return of our missing item with a small gathering. Nothing formal, nothing public. Your presence, if agreeable, would be appreciated. A. Penrose." Holmes had read the note only once before, folding it and setting it aside, but when the evening arrived he dressed carefully, selecting a dark wool coat and a scarf of practical, without unnecessary flair. Watson followed. The gas lamps along the Southwark streets flickered weakly in the cold wind as they approached the familiar facade of Penrose and Larchmere. The shop appeared much as it had on their first visit, modest but tastefully appointed. The window displays illuminated just enough to catch the eye without drawing attention. Holmes paused briefly at the entrance, his gaze lingering on the shop sign, though seeing it inside, the atmosphere was quieter, warm, and gently lit. Penrose stood near the main display case, dressed more formally than Holmes had ever seen him. His black tailcoat and starched collar were, though his eyes still bore traces of the worry and sleepless nights he had endured over the past. Clarissa stood nearby, dressed in a high-necked gown of dark blue velvet that complemented her auburn hair. Her expression, as Holmes noted immediately, was composed but softer than during their last. There was a calm to her, a visible loosening of the tightly held reserve she had shown. Larchmere, as expected, remained distant, occupying a far corner of the room, conversing quietly with a pair of business acquaintances. His smile appeared only when duty required it, and even then it never reached his eyes. Holmes and Watson entered without fanfare. Penrose crossed the room immediately, offering Holmes a firm handshake. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson, thank you for coming." Holmes inclined his head politely. "I wouldn't have missed it, Mr. Penrose." Penrose gestured toward the main display case, where the Royal Sapphire of Kashmir now rested in its rightful place. The velvet-lined tray cradled the stone carefully, its deep blue surface glowing softly under the muted gaslight over. Holmes approached the case with measured steps. Watson joined him, leaning slightly forward to observe the gem. "Remarkable," Watson murmured. "It looks untouched." Holmes gave a small, approving nod. "As it should be." There was no grand announcement, no speech, only a subtle shift in the mood as Penrose lifted a modest glass of port from a nearby tray and raised it. "To integrity," he said simply. The gathered guests, small in number and clearly hand-selected for discretion, echoed the toast without elaboration. Holmes sipped only lightly, standing near the case with one hand tucked into his coat pocket, observing both the stone and the faces around him. Clarissa approached after a few minutes, stopping at Holmes's side but keeping her eyes fixed on the sapphire. "I've never seen it look quite like this," she said softly. "It seems different somehow." Holmes glanced at her, then back to the gem. "Perhaps because you now know how easily something beautiful can be taken for granted." Clarissa smiled faintly but said nothing more. Watson, standing nearby, noted the unspoken understanding between them, the small exchange of words carrying more meaning than an entire conversation. Larchmere did not approach Holmes at any point during the evening, offering only a brief nod of acknowledgement from across the room before resuming his quiet dialogue with a silver merchant from Holborn. Holmes did not mind. The evening unfolded without incident. After half an hour, guests began to drift out into the cold night air, one by one. Holmes and Watson lingered near the door as Penrose bid farewell to the last of his business associates. Before they left, Penrose approached Holmes one final time. "I owe you more than I can say," Penrose, keeping his voice low to avoid being over. Holmes shook his head lightly. "What you owe me, Mr. Penrose, has already been paid." Clarissa appeared behind her uncle, offering Holmes a soft nod of thanks that required no words. With that, Holmes turned toward the door, Watson following him out onto the darkened Southwark street. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and distant coal smoke. Holmes paused beneath the shop's awning, glancing back through the window one last time at the Sapphire, resting in its velvet cradle. "Back where it belongs," Watson said quietly. Holmes nodded, pulling his scarf tighter against the cold. "Indeed, Watson," he said softly, "for now." And with that the two men stepped into the London night, their footsteps disappearing into the mist, as the jewel remained behind, silent, untouched, and at last at peace. The fog had begun to roll in thick and slow by the time Holmes and Watson made their way north through the streets of London. It was a late hour, well past the time when shopkeepers had shuttered their doors and when the usual clatter of horses and market carts had faded into the softer sounds of distant carriage wheels and the occasional footstep against wet cobblestone. Holmes, hands tucked into the deep pockets of his overcoat, moved with unhurried purpose along the footpath. Watson walked alongside him, their breath rising in visible clouds in the cold night air. The fog clung close to the ground, thickening in the hollows near alleyways and stretching like soft cotton over the lamplight, turning each street lantern into a muted halo against the darkness. "I must admit," Watson said, pulling his collar higher against the chill, "there's something oddly comforting about London at this hour, even with the fog." Holmes gave a slight nod, though his eyes remained fixed ahead. The city becomes quieter, more honest, when it thinks no one is watching. They turned onto the path leading toward Regent's Park, a route both men had walked countless times before, though tonight the familiar surroundings took on a different tone. The trees along the perimeter stood like vague, shadowed sentinels, their bare autumn branches reaching into the fog above them like skeletal fingers. Their footsteps crunched faintly against the damp gravel. Somewhere far off, a church bell struck the quarter hour, its chime dulled by the dense air. After several minutes of comfortable silence, Watson spoke again. "Do you ever wish for simpler cases, Holmes?" Holmes's gaze drifted toward a low iron fence at the edge of the park. "Simplicity is often an illusion, Wat. Even the cases that seem small at first often conceal more than they reveal." Watson smiled faintly. "A fair point, I suppose. Though I'd not object to a theft involving only a misplaced umbrella or a quarrel over a garden fence for once." Holmes's laugh was soft, almost relaxed. "Yes, a dispute over chrysanthemums would make for a refreshing change." They walked on, passing a row of gas lamps, whose glow barely pierced the thickening mist. The fog curled low along the ground, wrapping around their lips. They moved. For a time, both men fell into a thoughtful rhythm. Holmes, with his long, measured stride, Watson pacing a half-step behind, as was often his habit. Holmes paused at one point near a low stone wall that bordered the... He rested one gloved hand on the cool surface and looked out into the murk. "Fog always reminds me of the unsolved," Holmes murmured, almost to it. "The things left, just out of reach." Watson stood beside him. "And yet, tonight, the Southwark case is settled. The gem is back, the scandal avoided." Holmes nodded, but there was a distant quality. "But questions linger, not about the crime, but about the people." Watson tilted it. "You mean Wiggins?" Holmes remained silent. For him and others, Larchmere's cool detachment, Clarissa's sharp intuition, Penrose's choice of mercy over punishment. This case left its mark on more than one soul. Watson offered a small, reflective smile. "Including yours?" Holmes's expression softened. "Perhaps, in its own way." They resumed walking, their silhouettes fading and reappearing in the drifting fog. As they reached the far end of the park, the lamps grew fewer and the air colder. Watson pulled his coat tighter, glancing up at the few pale stars barely visible through the mist. Holmes, for his part, walked with head bowed slightly, hands still in his pockets, the soles of his boots making little sound against the slick pavement. Before turning toward Baker Street, Holmes paused at the corner where the path split in two directions, one leading home, the other leading deeper. For a moment, Watson thought his friend might choose the longer walk, as he sometimes did when restless, but Holmes stood still, considering, then finally turned toward home. As they approached 221B, Holmes spoke one last time, his voice low but clear through the fog. "Every case leaves behind some residue, Watson, some faint impression, like footprints on damp ground." Watson nodded as they climbed the steps to their door. "And in time, the rain washes them away." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile as he opened the door. "Yes, eventually." And with that, the two men stepped inside, leaving the cold, the fog, and the soft echo of unresolved thoughts behind them, at least for the night. Later that evening, after Watson had retired to his room and the sounds of Baker Street had dulled into near silence, Holmes remained awake in his chair near the hearth. The fire burned low now, reduced to a bed of glowing embers that cast a soft, restless light across the sitting-room walls. The fog outside pressed close against the window glass, thick as muslin, obscuring the lamplight from the street below. Beyond that veil, London moved on as it always did, cabs returning late passengers, distant footsteps on wet cobblestones, the occasional call of a newsboy far off in the night. But inside 200.1B, Holmes sat alone with his thoughts. The room was cluttered as always with the familiar detritus of their shared life. Watson's worn leather medical bag resting near the door, Holmes's scattered chemical flasks on the corner table, stacks of correspondence left unanswered. Yet tonight, Holmes paid no attention to any of it. Instead, he sat with his eyes half closed, his hands resting loosely in his lap, lost somewhere between recollection and deduction. The Southwark case had officially ended. The Sapphire returned. The confession written and locked away. Penrose had chosen mercy. Wiggins had disappeared to Sussex. All loose ends, at least in the conventional sense, were tied. And yet Holmes's mind would not settle. In the corner of the room, the small brass clock ticked steadily, its sound soft but insistent, like a distant memory demanding attention. Holmes's gaze drifted to the violin resting nearby. Normally, at times like these, he would reach for it without thought, letting the bow chase away restless energy with long, slow. But tonight, even music felt unnecessary. Instead, his thoughts moved backward, then forward, then backward again. He thought of Wiggins, the stooped pot, the trembling hand, the carefully hidden guilt that had festered in the man like a sickness. He thought of Clarissa, her keen observations, her quiet courage in coming to Baker Street that morning, her dried lavender pressed between the pages of Goethe. He thought of Larchmere, his cold reserve, his carefully rehearsed alibi, and the tight-lipped smiles that never reached his eyes, and of Penrose, the merchant with everything to lose, and yet enough wisdom to choose discretion over revenge. Holmes's mind circled these figures like pieces on a chessboard, replaying the case not for facts but for something harder to name, the emotional mechanics that had driven each person to act as they had. For Holmes, that was often the real mystery, far beyond locks, gears, or vault schematics. He reached over and pulled open the desk drawer, removing the folded confession. For a long time, he sat there, simply holding it. The paper was thin, but Holmes felt the full weight of its meaning. The confession was never sent to the yard. It would remain locked away, perhaps forever. Finally, Holmes rose, moving with slow deliberation to the small safe in the corner. He placed the envelope inside, turned the dial with practiced precision, and secured it. Turning back to the fire, he allowed himself one long, slow breath. Then, with a glance toward the clock on the mantel, Its hands now edging past midnight, Holmes extinguished the final gas lamp, leaving the room in near darkness, except for the fading glow of the embers. As he stepped toward his bedroom door, he spoke aloud, though no one remained to hear him. "The most delicate crimes," he murmured, "leave no trace but memory." And with that, Sherlock Holmes vanished into the shadows of his own thoughts, closing the door behind him as London exhaled into another fog-wrap. In the quiet days that followed, it was Watson who returned most often to Southwark. Holmes had moved on, at least appeared to. He buried himself in chemical experiments, spent long mornings reading obscure legal journals, and took solitary walks through Hyde Park whenever the weather allowed. His energy, though subdued, seemed focused on future puzzles, future clients, future deductions. But for Watson, the Southwark affair lingered. There was something in the human texture of the case that refused to loosen its hold on him. Unlike so many of their previous adventures, this had not been a tale of cold-blooded calculation or violent ends. No body had been discovered in the Thames, no pistol fired in a darkened alley, no courtroom spectacle. Instead, what had unfolded was something more delicate, and, to Watson's, more tragic. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when Holmes had taken himself out for one of his long, foggy walks, that Watson finally sat at his desk and pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer. He uncapped his pen and stared at the blank page for several long minutes before writing a single line at the case of the Southwark Sapphire, a study in quiet desperation. Unlike his usual chronicles, which often carried a tone of suspense or high drama, Watson approached this one with restraint. His sentences came slower, chosen with care. He described Wiggins not as a criminal, but as a craftsman cornered by life's steady, grinding pressure. He wrote of Clarissa, not as a mere background, but as a woman whose instincts and quiet resolve had shifted the course of the investigation in subtle, crucial ways. Penrose became, in Watson's account, a portrait of moral conflict, a man balancing business, reputation, and compassion in equal, uneasy measure. Even Larchmere received a paragraph of thoughtful observation. Watson made no accusations. There was no evidence for that. But he captured the businessman's cold distance, the practiced detachment, and left the reader to draw their own conclusions about the man's private code of conduct. Watson was careful, too, in how he depicted Holmes. He described his friend's surgical precision, his quiet interrogations, the way Holmes had pieced together small, overlooked fragments, both literal and emotional, to uncover the hidden mechanism and the hidden guilt beneath it. But he also allowed space for the softer side of Holmes, his decision to withhold the confession from the Yard, his quiet understanding of human weakness, and the rare near-silent acts of mercy that often went unnoticed outside of 221B. When Watson finished the final sentence, he set the pen down with a quiet exhale. The clock on the mantel read just past 5. Outside, the light was beginning to fade into that soft gray-blue twilight that London did so well. Watson stacked the pages neatly, bound them with a length of ribbon, and placed the manuscript inside the top drawer of his desk, not for publication, not for public consumption, but simply to keep. A private record, a story of human complexity, and perhaps one day a story Holmes himself might read if the mood ever struck him. Watson stood, stretching stiff limbs, and walked toward the sitting-room window. The fog outside was returning, softening the edges of the street lamp and wrapping the city once more in its familiar, comforting blur. He thought of Wiggins in his small cottage, of Clarissa tending to her ledgers under better circumstances, and of Holmes, walking somewhere out there in the fog, as he so often did when the city grew too small for his rest. Watson smiled softly. To some cases, he realized, didn't need to end with applause or notoriety. Some deserved only to rest quietly between the pages. The clock on the mantel had resumed its slow, unwavering rhythm, the same steady tick that had marked the passage of countless hours, countless cases, countless moments of triumph and defeat within the walls of 221B Baker Street. It was late. The city outside had long since quieted. Even the usual night sounds of carriage wheels and distant voices had faded beneath the thick cover. Holmes sat alone by the fire, the room lit only by the soft glow of the hearth and the small, persistent light from the gas lamp near the corner table. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, with the lingering trace of Holmes's pipe tobacco, though tonight the pipe itself remained untouched. Watson had retired early, worn from the week's events and the effort of putting the Southwark case to paper. The finished manuscript now rested in Watson's desk drawer, its ribboned pages carefully tucked away from both prying eyes and Holmes's habitual curiosity, yet Holmes suspected it's there. Of course he did. Holmes sat motionless, his long fingers resting on the arm of his chair, his gaze fixed. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the room, not intrusive but steady, deliberate. Holmes's mind drifted, as it often did down paths both recent. He thought of Wiggins, alone now in his small cottage along the Sussex, repairing church clocks, or villagers who would never know the full truth of the man working behind their tower walls. He thought of Clarissa Penrose, the sharp glance of her when she first spoke of the ticking sound in the vault, the quiet intelligence she had shown when others had dismissed her concerns, and of Edwin Larchmere, a man still wrapped in reserve, whose true thoughts and motives Holmes doubted he'd ever fully unravel. Then there was Penrose himself, a man whose decision to choose mercy had changed the course of several lives in ways none of them would ever truly calculate. Holmes's gaze shifted briefly to the violin resting in its case. He considered reaching for it, but let the thought drift away. Not tonight. Instead, his eyes returned to the mantel clock. Tick, tick, tick. That small rhythmic sound, so easily ignored during the noise of day, now filled the room like a living thing. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment and let his mind drift to the vault at Penrose and Larchmere, to the hidden panel, to the soft metallic click of the false bit, to the single blue sliver of sapphire caught in the teeth of so many delicate mechanisms, both mechanical and human, turning in their own patterns until something slipped. Tick, tick, tick. Holmes opened his eyes again, staring at the clock face. Every tick, he murmured aloud, voice low and slow, is a step toward either revelation or forgetting. The words hung in the air for several long seconds before fading into the soft crackle of the fire. Holmes leaned back into his chair, letting the weight of the room settle around him. The fog pressed against the windows. The fire burned low, and the clock, ever faithful, continued to mark time. Tick, tick, tick. By the time the clock struck midnight, Baker Street had surrendered fully to the quiet rhythms of the night. The fog, heavier now, pressed against the windows like a slow-moving tide, turning the glow from the gas lamps outside into nothing more than blurred halo against the dark. Inside 221B, the fire in the hearth had burned down to a reddish glow. Only the occasional crackle of settling embers disturbed the stillness. Holmes remained in his chair, though his posture had softened, shoulders no longer tense, his gaze no longer fixed. His long legs stretched out toward the fireplace, and his head rested lightly against the high back. For once, the restlessness that so often consumed him there was no nervous tapping of fingers, no pacing across the carpet, no reach for the violin or the syringe, or the chemistry center table. Only stillness and breath, and the slow sinking into quiet. Watson, already retired for the night, slept soundly in the next room, unaware of Holmes' lingering wakefulness. Outside, a light rain began again, so fine and soft that it barely registered against the glass, more a whisper than a storm. Holmes's eyes drifted closed then opened again, just long enough for him to glance at the small stack of items on the table nearby. The sealed confession from Wiggins, Clarissa's short note of thanks, the tiny blue sliver of sapphire still preserved in a vial, each item a thread in the tapestry of the Southwark case, now neatly folded and placed away, as Holmes did with all things. Yet, as he sat there, hovering between wakefulness and sleep, Holmes allowed himself one final observation, not a deduction, a conclusion, but a simple truth, that for all his calculations, for all his cold reasoning, for all his deliberate distance from the human element, some cases were not meant to end with applause or headline, or even a clear sense of resolution. Some were meant to fade, as all things do, into the soft haze of memory. With that thought, Holmes's breathing slowed. The fire dimmed further. The city outside dissolved deeper into fog and shadow. And somewhere just beyond the edge of consciousness, Holmes allowed himself to drift, not into restless calculation, but into genuine, untroubled. The clock on the mantel ticked on, marking the passing of seconds that Holmes, for once, chose not to count. And in that small, quiet room, the case of the Southwark Sapphire finally, fully, came to rest, into sleep, into peace, into memory.